Chapter 759. In the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar, the leaves on either side of the road gradually became round as they headed south. They also began to wither and yellow. The scenery along the road changed along with the climate, clearly depicting the landscape of this world. A horse carriage was steadily moving on the official road. Fan Xian, who had disappeared from this world for more than half a year, had finally returned to this world. The people who passionately hoped for his death or hoped for his survival still did not know of his return. After experiencing many hardships and passing through the snowy plains once again, the four of them quietly snuck into the world and did not send out a clear signal to any power. Haitang and 13th Wang knew the heaviness in Fan Xian's heart. Wu Zhu, who still did not have a trace of humanity, only sat silently at the back of the carriage. Presumably, he did not understand the trivial matters of the world and would not care about them. In the capital of Langya County in northern Qi, the carriage stopped outside an inn. After a while, Fan Xian left the inn alone and headed toward the busiest brothel in the city. Behind him, Wu Zhu, covered by a black cloth, followed at a moderate distance. It was not Fan Xian's intention to come out with Uncle Wu Zhu. However, he also did not understand. Uncle Wu Zhu clearly did not remember anything and knew nothing, so why did he continue to follow him? In a secret room in a branch of Baoyue brothel, Fan Xian saw Shi Chanli, who had already waited for a full 4 months, as well as Wang Qinian and Deng Ziyu. Under the powerful pressure of the Qing Emperor and royal palace, there were not many loyal subordinates who still stood bravely by his side. Other than the three in the secret room, there was only Xia Qifei, who was struggling to survive in Jiangnan. Seeing Fan Xian alive and well, the faces of these three loyal subordinates all revealed expressions of disbelief and joy. The entire world knew that Fan Xian had gone to the temple. In reality, everyone, regardless of whether they were Fan Xian's friends or enemies, thought Fan Xian would certainly die in the temple. Who would have thought that he would be able to return alive? After a moment of excitement, Fan Xian smiled and had everyone sit down. He had no time to talk about this journey that was not very pleasant and that even he could not explain clearly. Wang Qinian squatted to the side and smoked a pot. Deng Ziyu placed all the important intelligence reports in the world in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian glanced at it. The worry in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. Shi Chanli glanced at the blind youth beside the secret room. For some reason, he felt a chill in his heart. He didn't know who this person was to be able to come to such an important place with his teacher. He swallowed and said, "The Qing Kingdom's northern camp will break camp on the 3rd of June. The first contact between the two sides will be 7 days later. Why is northern Qi so defeated?" Fan Xian's expression became heavy. Looking at him, he asked, "Furthermore, in Langya County, I didn't sense much fear from the northern Qi people." The northern Qi side retreated 300 li strangely. According to our investigations, Shang Shanhu was not on the battlefield. Instead, he chose to defend the city of the Song Kingdom. Deng Ziyu stepped forward and replied. He then spread out the map on the table. Pointing at the battlefield, he said in a heavy voice, "This position is in the middle of the spine. If the Qing Kingdom's border army directly invades the north, Shang Shanhu will use the momentum to come out and directly attack the spine. Although this famous general has chosen to be on the defensive, his defense is unusually dangerous. This is the city that Shang Shanhu took after the battle in the north last year. So, this piece ultimately landed in this place." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He had not thought that while he was exploring the temple in the north, he would not know how much time had passed in the mountains. The situation in this land had long undergone an earth-shattering change. Just as they were returning south from the snowy plains, the Qing Iron Riders had finally begun their northern expedition. Since the Emperor has made up his mind to use the power of the entire country on an expedition to the north, the northern camp is nothing more than the vanguard. Under the invasion of such a murderous aura, Even someone as strong as Shang Shanhu can only choose to be on the defensive. This is dictated by the strength of the country. It has nothing to do with the genius of an individual commander. Deng Ziyu was, after all, an official of the Overwatch Council. Compared to Shi Chanli, he had a clearer assessment of the recent battle situation between the two powers of the north and south. Looking at Fan Xian with worry, he said, "The northern camp has left Songzhou. The northern Qi side has retreated 300 li. However, where the blade points, in the end, there has still been a great battle on the wasteland. The northern camp is temporarily resting and reorganizing, but there are frequent movements of soldiers in Yanjing. It looks like the second attack is close at hand. Although Shang Shanhu has the geographical advantage of that city, if Yanjing and the northern camp combine forces to attack the west, Shang Shanhu will probably have to be dragged into the field battle. I don't understand war, but I know that if the emperor has truly made up his mind, no matter how talented Shang Shanhu is, in the end, he can only be slowly exhausted to death." Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at the silent cities on the map. In a slow voice, he said, "It is clear that although Northern Qi has prepared for this battle for many years, in terms of military affairs, they are no match for the Qin kingdom. They only hope to exhaust the Qin kingdom until Shang Shanhu exhausts himself, but the emperor does not want to accompany him in exhausting himself. Even if they continue to exhaust themselves, the emperor will be the final victor." Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli glanced at Fan Xian with worry in their eyes. They were traitors of the Qin kingdom, but they were, after all, Qin people. They belonged to the third power in the world. At this moment, the battle between the two sides had begun. Their position and identity were truly awkward. Furthermore, they still didn't know what Fan Xian thought of this matter. Thus, during this month, the power that belonged to Fan Xian had not made a move. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and used his finger to gently tap the position of the nameless city. He thought that Shang Shanhu was probably preparing in the city that belonged to the Song kingdom in name. Suddenly, a powerful sense of unease surged in his heart. If I were the emperor, if I really wanted to fight for time and not waste it with Shang Shanhu, the simplest method would be for two powerful armies to advance together and then choose one to circle around to the back of the Song kingdom. Shang Shanhu would then want to hide his knife in its sheath. If we were to circle around to the back of the Song kingdom, that would be like borrowing a path from Dongyi. Although Dongyi belongs to the Qin kingdom in name, if the army were to enter Dongyi. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian. The Great Prince and the Black Knights are not in Dongyi. They are on the border between the Liang kingdom and the Song kingdom. If the Qin army wanted to borrow a path, they would probably receive a sudden attack. These words were not said clearly. Everyone in the secret room knew that Dongyi now belonged to Fan Xian. In such a battle that involved the entire world, what kind of attitude Dongyi would display? Whether or not the Qin emperor would valiantly send out troops was, in the end, a matter between the emperor and Fan Xian, father and son. If the emperor had not sent out troops to attack Dongyi at the beginning, it would mean that he knew I was not dead. Then, he would not have chosen this path in the future. Fan Xian sighed and rubbed the spot between his brows. Let's not talk about this anymore. In the end, it is not something I can handle. I only care about the situation in Jingdou and Jiangnan. All of these situations were in the files Deng Ziyu had submitted. There was too much content, and Fan Xian did not have time to read them all in detail. Jiangnan is stable. The court has withdrawn the new rules for the palace treasury bidding. As you expected, the salt merchants have also joined in the matter of the palace treasury bidding. Fortunately, the Ming family still holds a portion of the market. Of course, it is much more wretched than in previous years. Is Xia Qifei's person all right? After the assassination last year, the court did not make any further moves against Ming Garden. Governor Xueqing is only suppressing Xia Qifei. Looking at the moment, it will not carry out direct action. Fan Xian sank into deep thought. It looked like the emperor had, in the end, kept his promise in the palace. After all, the fate of the palace treasury was in his hands. If the emperor wanted to last through the ages, he could only temporarily take a step back in front of his threat. After Sun Jingxiu was removed from his position, the original plan was to be banished. For some reason, the palace suddenly sent down an edict and pardoned his crime. The young lady of the Sun family was released the night before she entered the educational workshop. Presently, life in the Sun Manor is very difficult, but the people of the He faction have been killed wretchedly, so no one will kick them when they are down. Speaking of this, a glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Deng Ziyu's lip. Although he had not participated in the Jingdo matter, the Overwatch Council's killing spree in Jingdo and the officials of the He faction were about to be wiped out. This truly made this abandoned official of the Overwatch Council feel incomparable joy. However, the people of the council have all withdrawn from Jingdo according to your orders, so they are unable to help. Fan Xian nodded. In his heart, he felt that the matter was more and more strange. When did the emperor become such a benevolent ruler? Was it just to keep the bet between them? Is everything all right at home? He shook his head and temporarily let go of the things he couldn't figure out in his heart. Gazing at Wang Qinian, he asked. Wang Qinian coughed twice and smiled as he replied softly, "They couldn't be better. Everyone in the world is dumbfounded. Princess Chun and young lady enter the palace every day to talk with His Majesty. Young master and young lady are also very healthy." The situation in Jingdo had indeed dumbfounded everyone under heaven. Fan Xian was now a traitor of the Qin kingdom, but the emperor had no intention of condemning the Fan faction. Even the women who should have been implicated now had faintly higher positions in the Qin kingdom than before the assassination in the royal palace. After Fan Xian heard this news, he couldn't help but be startled in the distance. Deng Ziyu suddenly opened his mouth and said, "The results of the investigation in Yingzhou show that the people who attacked Wenmao were border soldiers who had retreated from the south road pretending to be mountain bandits." A cold light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. He quickly asked, "Where are they?" "In the end, we found Wenmao's body. It was covered by the snow at the time." Deng Ziyu slowly closed his eyes. At the time, he was missing an arm. The old subordinates of the council searched for a long time but couldn't find him. "I'm going back to Jingdo." After a long silence, Fan Xian raised his head and looked at his three closest subordinates beside him. With great difficulty, he smiled and said, "Immediately retreat to Dongyi. Don't gather together again. Otherwise, if someone catches you all, where would I go to cry?" Hearing that Fan Xian was returning to Jingdo, Wang Qinian and the other two were shocked. Wang Qinian had been with Fan Xian the longest and understood Fan Xian's thoughts the best. He was also the least particular with his word. In a hoarse voice, he urged, "Although the emperor has not carried out a purge, you know that if you appear in Jingdo, he will stop at nothing to kill you. I know. Right now your life is involved in that bet. More importantly, as long as you are alive, the emperor will have some fear. Your life will affect the lives and deaths of many people." "I know." Fan Xian lowered his eyes slightly. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly. "But I will have to return to Jingdo because things will have to be resolved. Even if I hide in Dongyi for a lifetime, I still won't be able to resolve it." There was another death-like silence. A light suddenly flashed through Fan Xian's mind. He stared at Wang Qinian and asked, "We discussed earlier that the northern camp and Yanjing can clearly waste time with Shang Shanhu, but the emperor clearly doesn't want to waste time. Why is that?" Wang Qinian was silent for a moment. He then said, "There is news from the palace that the emperor's body seems to have problems." After these words were said, Deng Ziyu and Shi Chanli's expressions changed drastically. They knew that the emperor's health was the most important matter in the world. The problem was that one of them was responsible for the intelligence work of the old subordinates of the Overwatch Council, and the other was responsible for the Baoyue brothel intelligence network that covered the world. Yet, they had never heard any news related to the Emperor's health. Wang Qinian spoke with such certainty. It made it difficult for them to believe it. Fan Xian stared into Wang Qinian's eyes and slowly nodded his head after a long time. He knew where Wang Qinian's news came from. Even when Chen Pingping was alive, he did not know of Hongzhu's existence. However, Fan Xian had given it to Wang Qinian. Clearly, this news had come from Hongzhu. The secret room was silent for a long time. The three of them knew that no one in the world could stop Fan Xian's actions. Shi Chanli smiled with great difficulty and said, "Sir, are you not going to tell us the story of this journey? After Master Ku He, you are the first person to return alive from the temple. It's just a rundown temple. What is there to tell?" Fan Xian smiled. He knew that everyone was actually very curious about that illusory place. However, his mood was heavy and he indeed had no interest in talking. He only glanced lightly at Uncle Wu Zhu at the door of the secret room and wondered, when exactly will the blind uncle wake up? In Langia County, the group of 3 young warriors who had entered the Snow Mountain Temple parted. 13th Wang was going to use the fastest speed to hurry to Dongyi and inform the Great Prince, who was guarding Dongyi alone, as well as the people in the Sword Hut, of the news that Fan Xian was alive and Fan Xian's arrangements. Haitong's departure was within Fan Xian's expectations. The great battle had already begun. Although Northern Qi had the power to fight, the situation was dangerous. As a Northern Qi saint girl, Haitong could not stay out of it. She had to rush back to Shangjing and to the side of the Northern Qi Emperor. Using her identity as the leader of Qing Mountain's Tianyi Dao, she had to help her country resist foreign invaders. When they parted, the expression in Haitong's tired eyes made Fan Xian feel a strange sense of pity. He didn't know how long Northern Qi would be able to hold out against the Qing Emperor's valiant will and war to unify the world. He also didn't know if the beautiful royal palace would be burned to ashes if the Qing army actually broke through Shangjing. Or, in those flames, would Haitong, Lily, and the Emperor's woman be found. Regardless of whether it was from his personal view of history, personality, or any other aspect, Fan Xian could only have one attitude toward the bloody flames of war that slowly began. He had to stop all of this. However, he didn't make any promises to Haitong or express anything. He was just silent. Taking Uncle Wu Zhu, he walked alone toward the south. Under the clear sky, Fan Xian and Wu Zhu walked south in silence. Fan Xian's mood was heavy. He didn't know what he could do once he returned to Jingdou. For some reason, his instincts, as well as the news that the Emperor might be seriously ill, urged his footsteps to never stop. The most successful sidekick after Wang Qinian, Su Wenmao, had died. That autumn, the old cripple had died a long time ago. Even earlier, Yi Qingmei had also died. After experiencing the great joys and sorrows of the human race in the temple, Fan Xian should have viewed life and death more indifferently. For some reason, once he stepped into the world, there were more worldly thoughts in his heart. Remembering life and death and paying for life and death. How could he just laugh it off? It was still a black carriage. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and looked at Uncle Wu Zhu sitting beside the driver's seat. He was not surprised to find that the side of Uncle Wu Zhu's face was still delicate and pretty. The black cloth was still enchanting in the autumn wind. Everything was actually very similar to the scene from Jingdou to Danzhou 20 years ago. The one who was different was still Wu Zhu. This peerless warrior seemed to have lost his soul. He did not say a word or do a single thing. His cold face could not reveal whether or not he was curious about everything in this world that was both strange and familiar. Fan Xian felt a faint sorrow and gently let down the curtain. Shortly after, he smiled mockingly at himself. Back then, Uncle Wu Zhu was blind. Now, he had become a mute. What had his mother done in the past? What should he do? After the carriage reached Nanling County, it did not go any further. More accurately, the driver did not want to go any further. Although the Northern Qi court had long tried to downplay the war in the south, war was not as easily covered up as the scandal of the royal family. Everyone in the world knew what had happened in the center of the land. The millions of people all used indifferent and wary gazes to nervously wait for the result. Naturally, the driver did not want to enter the battlefield. Taking out silver to buy the carriage, Fan Xian took on the role of driver and continued south with Uncle Wu Zhu. On the way back from the icy plains, the abundant Yuanqi had already successfully healed Fan Xian's injuries. Although he knew that he still had no way of touching the boundary between humans and the sky, he believed that other than the Emperor, there was no one else in this world who could threaten him. After traveling for another dozen days, they passed through the simple wooden sheds on either side of the road and numb-looking groups of refugees. The uncle and nephew in the carriage seemed to be walking in a desolate area similar to the snowy plains of the extreme north. The number of people gradually thinned. Occasionally, a light snowfall would fall, but it could not hide the deathly silence on either side of the road. Occasionally, a few rotting corpses could be seen on the side of the road. In the mountains in the distance, villages that had been burned into ruins could be faintly seen. This was originally a piece of fertile land. Even though it was blown by the North Sea wind, the fertile land still supported many people. However, there was only desolation at the moment. Most of the people had already retreated to the rear of Northern Qi. Those who were unable to avoid the flames of war had become sacrificial pawns for the obsession of unifying the world. As for the villages that had been burned and the people who had been killed by the side of the road, Fan Xian did not investigate deeply whether it was the work of the invading Qing army or the scattered Northern Qi soldiers. War had always been the original sin of humankind. In this world, how could there be a good war and a bad peace? On the deathly silent road, the air was dry and carried the smell of blood. It surrounded the black carriage. Fan Xian drove the restless horses with a wooden expression. He also did not turn his head to look at Uncle Wu Zhu's expression beside him. He knew that the armies between the two countries were currently gathered in the southwest of Yanjing on the plains to the north. After the Qing kingdom's northern camp won, they temporarily returned to camp to rest and reorganize because they feared Shang Shanhu, who had remained motionless. The deathly silence here was, on the contrary, relatively safe. However, the traces of the previous battle were already shocking to the eye. It was difficult for him to imagine what kind of hellish killing field this world would become once the Qing Iron Riders broke through the city of the Song Kingdom where Shang Shanhu was and headed north at full speed. In the entire world, it seemed that there was only the sound of the carriage rolling along the road. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and waved his whip. He avoided a small group of Qing riders patrolling on the other side of the river and entered Qing territory. Wu Zhu, who had been silent since leaving the temple, suddenly opened his mouth to speak. The world outside the temple is not very good. Chapter 760. The first snow fell on the ancient city walls of Shangjing. The black and green contrasted beautifully with the palace, but it did not bring with it a trace of a cold and enchanting aura. No one took pity on the thin layer of white snow on the square. The sky had just begun to brighten when more and more officials began to mercilessly step on it, crushing the white snow into mud. These officials had serious expressions and hurried movements. They did not have the leisure to admire the snow. Battle reports from the south flowed endlessly into Shangjing and came to the Hall of Governmental Affairs beside the royal palace. The Hall of Governmental Affairs was completely enveloped in a tense and oppressive atmosphere. Fortunately, it was not very chaotic. The sky was very dark. The Northern Qi officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs were arguing about something. Then, a low voice stopped everyone's argument and made the Northern Qi cabinet recover its silence. In the silence, they quickly decided on a response. Concerning this battle, the northern Qi court had made many years of preparations. When the news of the Qing army's brazen attack came, no one was surprised. The methods of control and response during wartime quickly spread from the royal palace through the Hall of Governmental Affairs to this seemingly young, but actually already lasting for thousands of years. In a short month, all of northern Qi was mobilized. A bright yellow royal carriage left the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The officials did not send it off from the back. Instead, they threw themselves back into the busy military and political affairs. In such a dangerous situation, if there were still officials who dared to show off their ability to flatter, they had to be careful of whether or not their heads would be chopped off by the furious emperor. The royal carriage came to the front of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The northern Qi emperor, with a gloomy expression, swung his hand and jumped out of the carriage with a few thuds, scaring the eunuchs and serving girls beside him. He did not have the self-awareness to worry about his dragon body being injured. He turned around on the stone steps in front of the hall. The commander of the brocade guard beside the royal carriage, Wei Hua, and the other 3 important officials scolded in cold voices. The Qing kingdom's internal strife has dragged on for a year. Now that things have come to an end, you are still in such a panic. Why do I keep you useless people? A few important northern Qi officials felt a chill in their hearts. They knew that the emperor was not in a good mood. The battle report from last night, which had traveled thousands of li, stated that the Qing army in Yanjing had already begun to move. The Qi army stationed in Nanjing had been defeated again and again. Yet, the commander-in-chief, Shang Shanhu, was not in Nanjing. He was just hiding in that small city in the Song Kingdom and had not made a move. After some thought, the officials did not know where the emperor's anger came from. Was it because of the panic of the officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs? Was it because he was afraid of the Qing kingdom's hundreds of thousands of soldiers? Or was the emperor's suspicion of Shang Shanhu's deliberate silence? Wei Hua's body was very low. The present northern Qi court had long become an iron plate in the emperor's hands. No other faction dared to challenge the dignity of the royal family. Even Master Ku He's death 4 years ago did not change this trend. Furthermore, with a great enemy before them, no one dared to underestimate the authority of the northern Qi emperor. Wei Hua was a relative of the Empress Dowager and the emperor's trusted aide. He knew what the emperor's earlier words of internal strife in the Qing kingdom meant. To be able to delay the Qing kingdom's invasion for a year was completely because of the successive rebellions of the Qing Overwatch Council's last 2 masters. Wei Hua knew that regardless of whether it was the dead Chen Pingping or the unknown Fan Xian, why they would betray the Qing emperor, probably only the emperor knew the truth in all of northern Qi. Thus, he didn't say anything. Of the 3 officials, the old minister of war could no longer stand. He bravely stood out and tried to calm the emperor's anger. He was worried that the still young emperor would truly doubt General Shang Shanhu's loyalty. Presently, the Qing army was aggressively launching an invasion. If there was doubt between the ruler and officials, the result of this battle would be known without asking. As the nominal commander of the northern Qi military, this official could not just watch as there was any problem between the pillar of the northern Qi country, General Shang Shanhu, and the emperor, who used his maturity and steadiness beyond his age to calm the emotions of the officials in court. Thus, he prostrated himself on the ground and admonished endlessly. The northern Qi emperor's expression gradually calmed. He waved his sleeves and had the officials withdraw to deal with the urgent military reports from the south. He himself led Wei Hua into the main hall. Beside the dragon chair in the main hall, behind the bead curtain, the Empress Dowager, who had not listened to politics behind the curtain for many years, was waiting for their arrival. In front of the bead curtain, the northern Qi emperor bowed slightly. Wei Hua also bowed. The northern Qi emperor's expression had completely calmed. Looking at Wei Hua, he asked in a cold voice, "Are there any new movements from the Qing court?" Wei Hua was slightly startled. As the head of northern Qi's spy system, He was responsible for gathering intelligence from the court to the military. However, this intelligence had been delivered to the emperor's royal study early in the night. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer such a question. What exactly did the emperor want to ask? Pondering his words, Wei Hua furrowed his brows and said, "The Jingdo garrison of the Qing court is still Shifei, but Xiao Jinhua has been moved from Nanzhao back to the northern camp." Adding to the fact that Wang Jikuan has been stationed in Yanjing for generations, the movement of the Qing generals is not surprising. The northern Qi emperor furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Xiao Jinhua was once the deputy of the great prince of the Qing court. His performance during the Jingdo rebellion 4 years ago was mediocre. Additionally, his relationship with the great prince, so he was banished to Nanzhao by the Qing emperor. It is truly strange that he was moved back to the northern camp. What do you think of Wang Jikuan?" Wang Jikuan does not reveal himself. No matter how the Qing court changes, he still sits firmly in Yanjing. Based on the court's observations these years, the Qing emperor has kept him around in preparation for the current northern invasion. Wei Hua had no choice but to repeat the analysis of the Brocade Guard and the Ministry of War. The northern Qi emperor was silent for a moment. He then suddenly asked, "Is Yi Zhong still in Jingdo?" Wei Hua replied, "Yes." The northern Qi emperor stared at his face. A cold light shot out from his slightly narrowed eyes. "Are you sure?" Wei Hua's heart trembled slightly. In a low voice he said, "I'm sure." "Then that's strange." The northern Qi emperor glanced at the Empress Dowager behind the beaded curtain and shook his head. If the Qing emperor was truly prepared to finish this in one go, how could he still keep Yi Zhong in Jingdo? The Qing court had been tormented badly by Chen Pingping and Fan Xian these years. The generals who were truly good at fighting had either died or betrayed. The Qin family had all died, and the great prince had betrayed Dongyi. How could a mere Wang Jikuan make the Qing emperor feel at ease? If this old man didn't want to personally lead the army, at least someone like Yi Zhong should be placed in the north. Wei Hua's heart jumped slightly. He also couldn't understand why the Qing court had arranged the deployment of generals this way. A war between two powerful countries would not be a small skirmish. Even if Wang Jikuan had planned and prepared for this matter in Yanjing for 20 years, if the Qing military didn't bring out a truly powerful figure who could shake the country, how could they show their determination to the world and announce their tyrannical stance to Northern Qi? Northern Qi was not Dongyi. This country had succeeded the throne of the Wei kingdom. It had vast territory and a large population. The northeast plains were one of the granaries of the land. Although it had declined for a long time, under the sincere cooperation of the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, as well as valiant tactics, it had gradually shown its youth. Even with the Qing kingdom's strength and military power, if they wanted to attack northern Qi, it would not be a goal that could be achieved in a short amount of time. Presumably, given the Qing emperor's powerful self-confidence, he would not make such an arrogant judgment. The beautiful main hall of the northern Qi royal palace immediately sank into silence. The emperor slowly paced his feet under the throne. His brows were furrowed into a pretty circle. He was analyzing what his powerful counterpart in the Qing kingdom wanted to do. The war had already begun. There was no baiting or probing. Hundreds of thousands of people had already paid with their lives. Since the war had already begun, why did the Qing emperor still not display a ferocious and wolf-like aura? On the contrary, he appeared to conform to convention. Furthermore, there was a sense of pettiness in this kind of convention. Wei Hua also sank into silence. His gaze followed the emperor's footsteps and moved endlessly. He was also calculating endlessly in his heart. Although, in his opinion, given the might of the Qing military, it didn't matter who the Qing court used as commander. He faintly felt a glimmer of surprise to see the emperor look at the choice of commander of the Qing army this way. Suddenly, he thought of General Shang Shanhu, who was far away from the Qi defense line in Nanjing and alone in the city of the Song Kingdom. His heart jumped slightly. He wanted to say something but was afraid the emperor would become angry again. He gazed at the blurry figure behind the curtain of beads and secretly gritted his teeth. Perhaps the Qing emperor is afraid of General Shang Shanhu's military strategy and is unwilling to attack with all his strength. However, the army is slowly pressing forward, forcing a gap in the Qi defense line under this enormous pressure. The Qing court will use this gap to leap forward. Before he finished speaking, the northern Qi emperor had already smiled. More accurately, a not-quite smile rose to his face. He looked at Wei Hua's face calmly but also full of pressure. The gap Wei Hua spoke of earlier was not actually a gap in the arrangement of northern Qi's military power. Rather, it was a gap in the hearts of the people. Just like how the old Minister of War had remonstrated on the snowy ground earlier, the northern Qi officials were all worried that General Shang Shanhu, the pillar of the court, would provoke the emperor's anger because the war in the south was not going well. The two countries had been at war for over a month. As the commander of the south, not only did Shang Shanhu not stop the Qing army's invasion, he had also left the Nanjing defense line and hid in the distance. He ignored dozens of urgent edicts from the court and watched as the Qing army advanced 100 li. In the northern Qi court, the emperor's anger had already been displayed without any concealment. Sitting up straight, he said with a dark expression, "From now on, any official who dares to speak ill of the general will be beheaded. Anyone who causes trouble on the front lines will be beheaded. You are not bad. The Minister of War is also not bad." The northern Qi emperor looked into Wei Hua's eyes. "If, at this time, you still don't speak up for General Shang Shanhu, I'm afraid I will have to behead you. When a country is about to fall, I do not keep useless people or idle people." Wei Hua's body trembled slightly. Only now did he know that the emperor had probably completely opened his heart to General Shang Shanhu a long time ago, which was why he could face the tense situation so calmly. However, with this, who in the entire northern Qi court could control Shang Shanhu far away in the south? If Shang Shanhu truly had disloyal thoughts, do you know how to lead an army and fight? The northern Qi emperor suddenly asked with slight mockery. "I don't know military affairs. I can't either. Since it is so, things like fighting have to be left to people who know how to do it. Since I have used Shang Shanhu, I will continue to use him without hesitation," the northern Qi emperor calmly said. "From today onwards, the military and civil affairs of the 7 counties in the south will all be under General Shang Shanhu's command. Gather the power of the entire court to help General Shang Shanhu resist the enemy. In a moment, send down the edict." For some reason, Wei Hua stared in a daze and somewhat rudely at the young emperor in front of him. He suddenly felt his body heat up. His originally fearful emotions became unusually calm and determined. He knelt on one knee and replied crisply, "As you wish." Wei Hua withdrew from the royal palace. He didn't know what kind of waves the emperor's edict, which gave 1/3 of the power of the northern Qi court to Shang Shanhu, would bring. The northern Qi emperor, who had just issued the edict, was unusually calm. He looked coldly at the thin layer of snow outside the palace without a glimmer of fear. Everyone feared the Qing army's valiant and unparalleled battle power. However, the northern Qi emperor was not afraid because he had Shang Shanhu. Furthermore, he dared to use Shang Shanhu more thoroughly than any other ruler. Although he didn't know much about military affairs, he knew that the vast war between the two countries was, in the end, a competition of national power. As long as the northern Qi court didn't make any mistakes, no matter how powerful the invaders in the south were, they would not be able to destroy northern Qi in a few short months. In the end, everything needed time. The northern Qi emperor was still young, but the powerful ruler in the south was already old. The northern Qi emperor could keep the Qing emperor waiting, but the Qing emperor himself did not want to wait for too long. The Northern Qi Emperor narrowed his eyes slightly. There was still a question in his heart that he could not get rid of. If the Qing Emperor truly did not want to keep him waiting, why did the battle in the south appear so cold and tangled? Was the Qing Emperor worried about Shang Shanhu, Dongyi, or something else? He should be almost at Jingdou, right? The beaded curtain moved slightly. A girl wearing a flowery, cotton-padded jacket walked out from behind the curtain, supporting the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager looked warmly at the Northern Qi Emperor. She couldn't help but feel a powerful sense of satisfaction in her heart. With a son like this, or rather, with a daughter like this, what else was there to ask for? The Northern Qi Emperor turned around and looked at Haiteng Duoyao wearing the flowery, cotton-padded jacket. He smiled warmly and said, "Aunt Disciple, if you could bring heavenly soldiers and generals from the temple, why would I need to suffer so much?" Haiteng slowly shook her head and didn't say anything. She thought to herself, if the emperor knew that the support he wanted the most in his life had been destroyed by her and 13th Wang, what would he look like? Remember what Fan Xian told you before. This world is theirs and ours. In the end, it is ours. The Northern Qi Emperor seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly opened his mouth and calmly said, "I still don't know where his confidence comes from. Faced with the dangerous situation in the south, I can faintly grasp this feeling." Haiteng Duoyao was silent for a moment. She then said, "When he was in Jiangnan, he also said that we are the sun at 6 or 7 in the morning. The Qing Emperor is just a setting sun." The Northern Qi Emperor furrowed his brows slightly. It was as if even he didn't believe this judgment. The calmness on his face was actually mostly fake. He wasn't sure if the power of the entire country was in Shang Shanhu's hands. Would it be enough to temporarily stop the Qing Emperor's steps toward unifying the world? No matter how much of a genius Shang Shanhu was on the battlefield, in the end, he was only one person. The Empress Dowager, who had maintained a warm silence, suddenly laughed and said, "Looks like I, this setting sun, can only go hold my granddaughter." A wave of laughter finally rang out from the oppressive Northern Qi royal palace. The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Haiteng and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Come with me to see Hong Dauphin." In the royal palace of the Qing kingdom in Jingdou, a setting sun hung in the western sky. The weather was still warm and the twilight was like blood. It reflected off the red palace walls and bright yellow glazed tiles of the royal palace, making it seem like it was about to burn. The Qing Emperor, with a slightly tired and haggard expression, lay on a reclining chair in front of Taiji Palace. His fingers slowly combed the fur of a large, fat white cat. The fat cat seemed to enjoy the service of a powerful ruler. It lay lazily and occasionally turned its body, moving its soft abdomen close to the tips of the Qing Emperor's fingers. Of course, the fat white cat did not know how terrifying the Emperor's fingers were. A military general stood silently in the dusk, standing very close to the Emperor. He didn't say a word. He only looked at the white cat under the Emperor's command and the two fat cats stretching lazily behind the wooden chair. He couldn't help but feel that it was absurd. These three cats were yellow, black, and white. They all looked unusually fat from being raised. However, the palace rarely kept these small pets. No one knew how these seemingly ordinary cats had obtained the Emperor's favor. None of the emotions in his heart showed on the general's face. Even if a 2-year-old baby died in front of him, he would not be moved in the slightest. Furthermore, he was not a brute who only knew how to fight. Before he returned to the capital and entered the palace, he had already found out enough information. These three fat cats belonged to the Fan Manor. They had been raised by Princess Chen since they were young. At some point, she had brought them into the royal palace to play with the Emperor. The Emperor had kept these three cats until now. They seemed to be just three cats, but in the eyes of this general, he always felt that this seemed to represent a deeper meaning. However, he did not dare to ask, nor did he have anyone to ask, because no one in this world knew whether that person was dead or alive. The Qing emperor pulled back his gaze from the sunset clouds and glanced at the general. He said, "That kid in northern Qi is only acting for you to see. The court raises so many people in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Are they doing nothing?" It was impossible to tell how old this general was because his gaze was clear and cold. He seemed very young, but his face was full of hardships. After thinking for a moment, the general straightforwardly said, "On the battlefield, we use direct tactics and surprise to win. No matter how cunning Shang Shanhu is, as long as your majesty gives the order, the lives of the 3 armies of the Iron Riders of the Qin Kingdom will not disappoint your expectations. As for the matter of using troops, your majesty can decide on your own. There is no need for the Bureau of Military Affairs to do more useless work." These words were not flattery. A flattering official would never say such harsh words. Rather, it was true. This general had great faith in the emperor's military abilities and naturally sighed with emotion. Northern Qi has retreated again and again with the intention of retreating to the front line in Nanjing, using distance to exchange for time. That kid wants to waste time with me. A disdainful smile rose to the corners of the Qing emperor's lips. Shang Shanhu has his hand on the waist. It is indeed brilliant. However, the situation is as such. As long as this nail is pulled out, who can stop my army from heading north? The north needs a commander. The Qing emperor closed his eyes and allowed the blood-like dusk to envelop his thin face. Wang Jikuan has been raised for a dozen years. He has become somewhat blunt. To pull out this nail, Shang Shanhu, he must pass through Dani. Although I have not sent down an edict, it is clear that Governor Wang is afraid of the 4,000 Black Knights and the 10,000 soldiers in the boss hands. If he is so restrained, how can he succeed? Immediately after, the Qing emperor glanced at the young general and furrowed his brows slightly. "You have just returned from the grasslands. You are not clear on the matters of the Bureau of Military Affairs. Don't always argue with your father. As a son, this is improper." For some reason, the topic had turned in this direction. The general's heart chilled. He lowered his head and agreed. The Qing emperor stared at his face and slowly said, "Don't count on me sending you to the north to pull out the nail. You don't have enough experience. Most importantly, after entering and exiting the grasslands, you have honed your ruthlessness. However, your craftiness and patience are still lacking. You are not a match for Shang Shanhu." The general abruptly raised his head. A glimmer of dissatisfaction appeared on his face. "Yi Wan, you are still too inexperienced," the Qing emperor slowly said. "The Hu people of the grasslands are not as cunning as the people of the central plains. You have entered deep into the grasslands in pursuit of the chief's court. Your courage is commendable. Have you thought about why the 7,000 Northern Man Iron Riders are still unable to come into contact with the court? If the court met up with the 7,000 Man Riders on the snowy grasslands, would you still be able to escape back alive?" This young general was one of the rising stars of the Qing court. He was the son of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong, and the commander of the Qingzhou victory, Yi Wan. After the Qingzhou victory, Yi Wan had led 4,000 Qing elite Iron Riders in pursuit of the remaining soldiers of the chief's court. He had earned a fearsome reputation on the grasslands. In the end, he had returned alive from the grasslands. Although there were only 800 of the 4,000 Iron Riders left, such an achievement was a remarkable matter in any of the Qing kingdom's military operations. However, the Qing emperor's light words struck a certain corner of this young general's heart. It also startled the faint doubt in Yi Wan's heart. Why was it that during the months of dangerous pursuit, Chief Su Bida's remaining soldiers of the court were still unable to make contact with the 7,000 Man Riders? Yi Wan's heart trembled slightly. He looked at the emperor's face, which was gradually showing signs of age. He wanted to seek an answer. Although Fan Xian took Haitang Duo to the temple, he still did not forget to set up a contingency plan on the grasslands, the Qing emperor said with an indifferent expression. Martial arts are always outside of poetry. Victory and defeat are also outside of the battlefield. When you understand this, the commander of my northern expedition will be you. Yuan stood silently by the emperor's side. His heart felt slightly heavy. Victory and defeat in this world is actually outside of the battlefield. Within a year, if Fan Xian dies, I will have one. If I die, the people in this world who do not like me will have one. It was as if the emperor was narrating the matter of someone else. His fingers tightened gently and lifted the fat white cat into his arms. He gently combed its fur meticulously. Chapter 761. Tomorrow I will only write 3,000 words. I have to slow down because I don't know how to write anymore. Hearing the emperor's words, the expression on Yi Wan's face did not change. His slightly lowered head just happened to hide the strange light in his eyes. In his youth, this powerful figure who had abruptly risen in power in the Qing kingdom had fallen out with his father and traveled all the way from Dingzhou to Nanzhao. If it were not for the secret care of the man on the throne from the royal palace in Jingdou, and if it were not for the steady willpower he had developed through these years of suppression, how could he have been suppressed all this time and finally exploded violently? It was precisely this kind of experience that allowed Yuan to possess a powerful ability to control himself. Earlier, when the emperor pointed out that he was not a match for Shang Shanhu, a glimmer of dissatisfaction appeared on Yuan's face. This glimmer of dissatisfaction was actually purposely revealed. It was not difficult to accept that he was not a match for the famous General Shang Shanhu. However, he was, after all, a leader of the new generation of the military that the emperor thought highly of. If he appeared too wooden and lost the vitality and competitiveness that a young person should have, it would probably not be easy to deal with. Hearing Fan Xian's name, the strange light in Yi Wan's eyes came from the bottom of his heart. It was not only because the emperor had pointed out earlier that part of his great achievements on the western Hu grasslands was because of Fan Xian's secret help. It was also because Yuan had shockingly discovered that the emperor's words earlier had raised Fan Xian's life and death to a position completely equal to the emperor's life and death. The entire world knew what kind of person Fan Xian was. Although Yuan was often on the front lines in Nanzhao and basically did not participate in Jingdou matters, the relationship between the Yi manor and Fan Xian was complicated. How could he not secretly understand the young powerful official who had successfully changed his sister's personality, the major figure who, in a few short years, had lit up the Qing kingdom's sky like fireworks? Yuan had suppressed himself for many years and watched the world from the sidelines for many years. He had his own bearing and self-confidence. He had never thought that he would be any less than those rising figures under heaven. However, the emperor had long placed him quietly in an outer county, so he lacked a stage. This stage had already appeared under his feet. After the Qingzhou victory and the subsequent blood-soaked pursuit, he had begun to blossom with dazzling brilliance. However, each time he thought of Fan Xian's name, he always felt strange. It was not jealousy or envy. Rather, it was a faint coldness. Yuan had coldly watched Jingdou for many years and always felt unable to see through Fan Xian. After thinking it carefully, there was admiration, wariness, sympathy, and disdain. It was unusually complicated. Even so, Yuan still did not think that Fan Xian was a major figure who could shake the world. He thought it was because he believed it to be it. He believed it. He believed it to be. He believed it to be. After the 4 great grandmasters had left, apart from the 2 sovereigns of the north and the south, no one else should be able to stand in that position. Do you think I have to raise to him? That is true pride. Yuan sternly accepted the lesson. In the dusky light, he bowed sincerely to the emperor. The emperor narrowed his eyes. Under the dim light, The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes added a sense of age. In a slow voice, he said, "There are many people in this world who can escape my control. However, there are very few who can stand against me calmly without moving or falling into chaos. Naturally, you do not see Ng as clearly as I do." These words were true, but they were also somewhat vague. During the winter snow at the beginning of the year, Fan Xian had acted wantonly and violently in Jingdo. In one day, he had killed all the officials of the He faction, shocking the court and the world. He had entered the palace to carry out an assassination and had been branded a rebel. What confused all the officials and caused all the rumors in the tea-houses to lose their direction was that the Qing court had indeed spent a great deal of effort to hunt down Fan Xian and the assassin who had entered the palace to carry out the assassination. However, they had never acted against the power Fan Xian had spread around. The old officials of the Overwatch Council, who had clearly participated in the case of killing the He faction in Jingdo, were not even tried. They were only dismissed in large numbers. The power of the Fan faction in the Jiangnan area also did not receive the pressure of the royal palace. The emperor, who had always been ruthless and resolute, seemed to have lost the heart of an emperor he had always maintained when facing Fan Xian. He appeared overly gentle and benevolent, even to the point of being muddle-headed. No one dared to criticize the emperor, but many people were doubting him. Why did the emperor show mercy to the deranged Fan Xian's rebel faction? Did this matter truly have a background that could not be revealed? After Yi Wan returned from the grasslands with great difficulty and learned of the aftermath of the Jingdo chaos, he was also shocked and confused. The reason it was like this was because none of the important officials knew that the emperor and Fan Xian had talked for an entire night in the royal palace that snowy night. It was not that the emperor did not want to get rid of the Fan faction. Rather, his heart was touched and he had no choice but to abide by the promise of a two-person battle with Fan Xian. If the court truly carried out a purge of the Fan faction, what the Qing kingdom was about to welcome would probably be the largest upheaval since the founding of the country. It had to be said that in the handling of this matter, the emperor lacked a sliver of the courage he had in his wild advance in the past and gained a bit of worry and gentleness. It had to be said that only Fan Xian could understand the emperor's thousands of generations of intentions and also hold the lifeline of the Qing kingdom tightly to force the emperor to take such a stance. In this world, the only person who could force the Qing emperor to put down the butcher's knife in his hand was Fan Xian. As long as Fan Xian does not die, my heart will not be at ease. The emperor's fingers that were combing through the white cat's fur suddenly froze slightly. He slowly closed his eyes and spoke to Yi Wan beside him. Yi Wan's heart chilled. He lowered his head and said nothing. "How is your practice of the flowing cloud release going?" the emperor asked coldly. Yi Wan's heart jumped slightly. He did not understand why the emperor had suddenly changed the topic and began to test his cultivation. He thought for a moment and replied sincerely, "I have just entered the door. 20 years ago, your father practiced the coffin breaker to the extreme but was unable to advance any further. Although Fan Xian is unusually hard-working, after learning the coffin breaker from your sister, it is clear that there is no way for him to make further progress. Uncle Liuyun's skills cannot be lost like this. Since you have entered the door, my heart is at ease." The emperor continued to close his eyes and said, "Even so, in the end, you are not a match for Fan Xian. If you meet him in the future, take 3 steps back." Yi Wan's heart jumped again. Although he was indeed not satisfied with being judged by the emperor to be inferior to Fan Xian, from the emperor's earlier words about Fan Xian not being diligent and the emperor not being at ease, Yi Wan had already guessed too much. To be able to make the emperor, who was as powerful as a god, use national affairs and war as the price to lure and kill him, he probably truly could not compare. Following this, a fierce and stubborn emotion rose involuntarily in Yi Wan's heart. The expression of the most dazzling general of the younger generation of the Qing army did not change, but he faintly longed to be able to have a face-to-face battle with Fan Xian in the future. The night gradually eroded the twilight and surrounded the layers of the royal palace, enveloping the ruler and official in front of Taiji Palace. The emperor slowly opened his eyes. The light in his eyes seemed to want to illuminate the entire royal palace in an instant. Eunuch Yao came to the side of the emperor's soft couch. He held a wooden tray in his hand. On the tray was a yellow silk cushion. On it were two items that looked like letters. Yuan was slightly surprised. He didn't know what this meant and unconsciously glanced at the emperor. One is the essence of the martial method I cultivate. The other is a secret edict I left for you. The emperor's eyes were level as he casually said, "Within a year, if I die, the secret edict can be opened. If I do not die, then burn the secret edict. As for the essence of the martial method, if you can make progress, consider it some compensation from me to the Yi family." Yuan did not understand what compensation meant, but he understood the words, essence of the martial method. Even the weather-beaten and ruthless General Li, who had killed without blinking on the grasslands, couldn't help but be moved. His body trembled slightly. Without hesitation, he knelt in front of the emperor and kowtowed heavily. Yuan did not decline insincerely. He knew that the emperor had written his experiences as a great grandmaster in this letter. For him, it was, without question, a priceless treasure. The emperor's actions were naturally because he hoped that the Yi family would remain absolutely loyal to the royal family in his hands. This kind of trust made every inch of Yuan's skin begin to tremble. "A few days ago, I made you the martial tutor of Qingping. Since this is so, you should visit Shufang Palace more often." The emperor did not seem to care at all. Earlier, he had casually tossed the essence of the tyrannical martial method to an official. It was as if he was not worried about Yuan's loyalty to the royal family. The mental blow Yuan had received when he saw the emperor was too great. His face was slightly pale, but it did not affect his thinking and judgment. From the emperor's words, he immediately understood the meaning. The bloodline of the royal family had withered. The great prince had not rebelled, and his army was far away in Dongyi, contending with the court. The second prince and crown prince had long died tragically. After Fan Xian's rebellion, his whereabouts were unknown. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. Although Consort Mei in the palace seemed to be about to give birth, the only person the court officials faintly saw as the heir was the third prince, Li Qingping. Ever since the emperor had been injured at the beginning of the year, his health had not improved. Although his recovery was faster than that of a normal person, he always appeared tired easily. He had less control over court matters than in previous years. Fortunately, Hu the scholar and Panling the scholar were in charge of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, so there were no problems. However, 3 months ago, the third prince, who had been under house arrest in the palace for half a year, had suddenly been ordered by the emperor to attend a lecture in the royal study. During this month, the third prince had begun to look over memorials on the emperor's behalf. This allowed the entire Qin court to guess the emperor's intentions. The emperor had made Yi Wan a martial tutor. Now, he had secretly given him a secret edict, secretly given him the martial method, and ordered him to be closer to the third prince. Without asking, one knew what he meant. Yi Wan was shocked and grateful. He prostrated on the ground and kowtowed again. "Go. Remember what I said today." The emperor gazed at the increasingly dark eaves of the palace and narrowed his eyes slightly. Slowly he said, "Particularly that line. Of my sons, Anji is the most ruthless. If he truly survives, you must take 3 steps back in front of him." Yuan's brows furrowed slightly. Suddenly, a glimmer of anger surged out of nowhere. This anger was not because the emperor had told him to take 3 steps back when he saw Fan Xian. Rather, he felt that Fan Xian was truly treasonous, disloyal, and unfilial. He was not an official or a son. He was not a thing. However, he didn't say anything. After bowing solemnly again, he followed the long corridor toward the outside of the royal palace. As he walked, Yuan's shoulders felt heavier and heavier. His mood also grew heavier and heavier. For one, he knew the emperor had given him a heavy burden. For another, he had suddenly smelled an inauspicious smell from the emperor's conversation. It was the smell of an old man. Yuan's heart trembled slightly. A difficult-to-suppress sorrow pressed down on his heavy figure as he walked through the royal palace. Without the emperor there would not be the Yuan of today. The loyalty of the next master of the Yi family toward the Li royal family had never wavered. However, in this moment, he felt that the emperor seemed to be entrusting an orphan to him earlier. Why was this? Why was this? Although the emperor was old and tired, he was still powerful. Why would he say such things and make such arrangements? If the emperor truly died and the third prince took the throne, given the relationship between Shufang Palace and the Fan Manor, would the Qing court not become the world of that treacherous official, Fan Xian? Yuan only felt a chill pierce through his back into his brain. He didn't dare to make any more guesses. Raising his head, he coldly walked out of the royal palace. There was no light in front of Taiji Palace. It was still dark. The emperor did not look at Yuan's slightly sorrowful background. He only stared coldly at the darkness in front of him. It was as if he wanted to find a fire that belonged to him in this darkness. After a long silence, the emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said, "In my life, I have given birth to a few sons. Who would have thought that I would be forced into such a wretched state by Enji in the end? Who would have thought that he would actually come back alive from the temple?" A cold light flashed through the corners of the emperor's eyes. He paused for a moment and then said, "In the end, I am the old man, and he is the son. How can there be a son who can defeat the old man in this world?" Accompanying him, eunuch Yao broke out in a cold sweat. How could he respond to the emperor's muttering to himself like this? The emperor suddenly let out a desolate sigh. He looked at the royal palace walls that appeared particularly tall in the dark night. He looked at the not very bright imperial army lights on the walls and narrowed his eyes slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. After the assassination attempt in the royal palace, the emperor had never left the palace again. In the eyes of many officials, this was the emperor's habit. Some people thought that perhaps the emperor's body was not completely healthy, so he was recuperating in the palace. However, only he knew that the reason he did not leave the palace was because he did not dare to leave the palace. That day, the thunder above the royal palace had sounded. The black box that had been floating in the air, and remained outside of the Qing emperor's control, had dealt the heaviest blow to this powerful ruler. Although the blow this time was not fatal, it had successfully shattered this ruler's confidence. There were truly things in the world that could easily kill him. The emperor had always been afraid of that box. Now that he knew that the box was outside the royal palace, although it was not in Fan Xian's hands, it was in the hands of his enemy. How could he leave the palace? The emperor didn't know when the box would make a sound again, but he knew that Fan Xian had returned alive. Fan Xian had already returned. Where was Lao Wu? The emperor lowered his eyelids slightly. Guarding the lonely palace could allow his edict to spread throughout the world. However, this tall royal palace and long palace walls were also like a perimeter wall, imprisoning him in the depths of the palace. "If Enji does not die, my heart will not be at ease." A stern expression slowly rose to the emperor's thin face as he spoke coldly. However, the old and haggard wrinkles did not flatten because of this dark and stern expression. They were like the bark of a withered tree, appearing irreversible and shocking to the eye. This was the second time the emperor had said these words today. Between him and Fan Xian, there were too many complicated past events, present grudges, and differences in ideals. It was inevitable that they would fight to the death. Even so, the Qing emperor greatly admired his most accomplished son. The more he admired him, the angrier he became. In his entire life, he had never wanted someone to die as much as he did tonight. Perhaps only when he discovered that Chen Pingping had betrayed him and had secretly betrayed him for many years would he be as angry as he was now. The Qing emperor had the way of a king in his heart. He rarely felt joy or anger. Once he fell into mortal emotions, he was still nothing more than a mortal. He looked at the dark palace with a complicated expression and thought of the box that had disappeared. He thought of Fan Xian and Lao Wu, who he didn't know where they were heading toward Jingdo. On the contrary, his earlier anger returned to absolute calm. The sound of hurried footsteps came from the long corridor behind the soft couch. Eunuch Yao angrily turned his head to look. He saw Eunuch Hongzhu, who had long returned to the royal study to work by the emperor's side, holding a lantern and walking over with a face full of joy. Chapter 762. Consort Mei did not disappoint her clan, Jingdo, or even the entire Qin kingdom, who feared the third prince, Li Chengping. She successfully gave birth to a child in the autumn of the 12th year of the Qin calendar. In the tense situation of the war in the north, it had to be said that the addition of a bloodline to the royal family was good news and a good omen. It was a pity that her birth was not very noble. Her home was on the small side. Otherwise, presumably, the entire Jingdo would be even livelier because of the birth of this little prince. The third prince, Li Chengping, had gradually grown up these years. In front of others, he had always displayed a steady, educated, and well-mannered side. Additionally, he was listening to politics in the royal study and had been personally taught by Hu the scholar. He should have been the only choice for heir. Consort Mei's birth should not cause too much of a disturbance. However, not all of the officials had forgotten the Baoyue brothel incident. On the surface, it was a battle between Fan Xian and the second prince, but the ones pushed to the front of the stage were the second master and the third prince. The second master of the Fan family had escaped to northern Qi and had yet to return. Although the third prince's role in this matter had been wiped clean by the palace, it could not be hidden from the eyes of most people. More importantly, everyone in the world knew that this prince had a close relationship with Fan Xian. It was extraordinary. Fan Xian only had a ruthless and cruel side to the civil official system of the Qing dynasty because of the incident of him killing an official in the street. No one wanted Fan Xian to have a day where he could rise again. Most importantly, there were too many clever people in the Qing officialdom. Although the emperor had not said it explicitly, after many years, he had chosen to once again choose beautiful women to enter the palace after purging the Overwatch Council. These people had long guessed the emperor's intentions. Thus, the addition of another bloodline to the royal family added a faint sense of mystery. The good news in the palace was not publicly announced. It was just that the omnipresent tongues had been sent out of the palace ahead of time. In one night, all of the officials knew of this matter. Some of the prudent officials were deeply worried, some were secretly excited, and some let out a breath. However, even more people became nervous. While the officials were in their manners thinking about what kind of words they should write when they went to court the next day, the emperor, who had gained a son in his old age, was not as moved as these outsiders. Hongzhu, the writing eunuch in the royal study, continued to kneel obediently beside the emperor's soft couch. His knees were aching from kneeling. Cold sweat flowed endlessly down his back. A long time had passed since the message had been sent, but the emperor had been lying silently on the soft mattress. He did not show any expression of joy. He did not even have the interest to get up and go to concubine Mei's bedroom to have a look. Hongzhu didn't know what had happened. He didn't know what the emperor was thinking in his heart. He was just blindly nervous. He didn't know that Fan Xian was still alive and was heading toward the Qin kingdom's Jingdo. Following his duty as a eunuch servant, he kowtowed again and carefully reminded the emperor if it was time to rise. The emperor waved his hand in annoyance. He did not get angry, but he did not rise. On the contrary, he said to Eunuch Yao beside him, "Do you think I will have the chance to see this son grow up?" Eunuch Yao's heart jumped slightly. He quickly bowed and piled on a smiling face to say a lot of nonsense. It was nothing more than the emperor being in his prime and living for thousands of generations. A glimmer of tiredness flashed across the emperor's thin face. The corners of his lips twitched slightly in a mocking smile. No one knew whether he was mocking the people of the world or himself. If Chen Pingping was still alive, how would he respond to this question? It would probably be much more interesting than Eunuch Yao. However, that old dog seemed to have died a long time ago. Looking at the unchanging night scene in the palace in front of him, he suddenly thought of the letter the second prince had left him a few years ago. He also thought of the last conversation he had with the crown prince and the words the crown prince had said. "Father, please be more merciful to the people who are still alive." Li Qingqian's voice seemed to still echo in his ears, making the emperor's heart tighten slightly. His brows furrowed slightly. Quietly, he sighed and said, "Who will be more merciful to me?" The next day, the officials, who were preparing to wantonly present congratulatory memorials to flatter the emperor, were stunned to learn a piece of news that shocked and panicked them. Consort Mei had given birth to a son. However, there was a great deal of postpartum bleeding. The royal doctors tried to save her for an entire night but were unable to save her. Unfortunately, she passed away and died in the palace. Fortunately, the little prince, who had lost his mother when he was born, was in good health. After the emperor's grief over Consort Mei's death, he ordered Imperial Consort Yi to raise him in Shufang Palace. Imperial Consort Yi was raising him in Shufang Palace. That meant that in the future, Imperial Consort Yi would be the little prince's birth mother. Thinking of this, the officials, who had been wondering who the dragon chair of the Qin kingdom would belong to, were stunned speechless. They all knew that the emperor's arrangements had basically eliminated the possibility of this little prince ascending to the throne. Consort Mei was already dead. The little prince no longer had any protection in the palace. The Mei family was also very weak. If he was raised by Imperial Consort Yi, how could he have a day of success? The midday sun shone down on the walls of the royal palace, adding a great deal of warmth to this autumn day. However, the warmth inside the palace was not sufficient, particularly in Consort Mei's bedroom. It was cold and quiet. The newborn little prince had long been taken away. The nannies and related serving girls had also gone with him to Shufang Palace. Other than the faint sound of crying, there was not a glimmer of joy. Consort Mei's body had already been tidied up. It lay quietly on the large bed and had not been moved. This delicate and pretty girl, who Fan Xian had once met, still did not escape the misfortune in the royal palace. Perhaps it was because she had lost too much blood, but her face was snow-white like frost. Under the midday sun, it reflected a cold and unresigned glow. Fan Xian had once sincerely wished for her to give birth to a princess. Unfortunately and pitifully, she still successfully gave birth to a prince. Fan Xian's original worry was that after the prince consort Mei gave birth to grew up, he would once again bring unease and bloodshed to the royal palace. Probably even he had not expected that Consort Mei would pay the price with her life right after the little prince was born. The midday sun shone as brightly as the royal palace. Why was it that when it shone on that pretty white face it was still so cold? Fan Manor, sighed Study. Fan Shunning and Fan Liang were taking an afternoon nap with Cece's company. The sunlight shone on the trees and flowers in the Fan Manor's garden. It painted a complicated light and shadow on the window of the study. Inside the study, Lin Wan sat by the desk with a serious expression. After a long silence, she finally couldn't resist sighing and said, "Consort Mei's life has been hard, but this is good. She can be given to Imperial Consort Mei to raise. In the future, there will be no more disturbances." There was only her and her sister-in-law, Fan Ruoro, in the room. During this half a year, The two of them often entered the palace to keep the emperor, who was growing older by the day. They were familiar with the matters in the royal palace. They had even seen Consort May, who was as beautiful and proud as a snow plum, a few times and was no stranger to her. However, they had not expected that Consort May would die from a difficult birth last night. Fan Ruoro was not a person of many words. Hearing her sister-in-law's sigh, she was silent for a long time before raising her head. Looking into her eyes, she lightly said, "If you want to blame someone, you can only blame her parents for insisting on sending her to that shameful place." This was something Yuan Chun had once mentioned in Story of the Stone. Lin Wan knew that Fan Xian had written it. However, she was an intelligent and quick-witted person. She immediately heard the meaning behind her sister's words. The tips of her brows furrowed slightly. The emperor's bloodline is thin. Furthermore, Imperial Consort May has always been in charge of the palace. You and I know her personality. It couldn't be anything. Both of them knew that. Fan Ruoro thought for a moment and then shook her head. Of course, Imperial Consort May is not that kind of person. However, I have taken Consort May's pulse a few times in the palace and heard the sound of the baby many times. On the 7th day of the new year, after she was stabbed by brother, she was particularly careful and took good care of herself. Her body is also stronger than when she first entered the palace. In my opinion, although it is her first child, it shouldn't be so troublesome. It is always easy for accidents to happen when it comes to childbirth, Lin Wan said with lingering fear as she thought of the time she gave birth to Fan Liang. Fan Ruoro furrowed her brows for a long time and then slowly shook her head. I heard it was a natural birth. I still feel this matter is strange. It was silent in the study for a long time. Lin Wan looked at her and lowered her voice. But this doesn't make sense. It indeed did not make sense. There had always been many shady things in the Qing royal palace, but no one dared to do such a truly terrifying thing. In particular, Consort May's dragon seed was something the emperor had only obtained when he was old. The palace had always been personally managed by eunuch Yao. Even Shufang Palace did not interfere to avoid arousing suspicion. Who could harm Consort May? Fan Ruoro suddenly said in a quiet voice, "Consort May's due date is later than originally calculated." Lin Wan's heart trembled slightly. She looked at her eyes in disbelief and asked, "Who would be so daring?" Fan Ruoro shook her head and replied, "In the Forbidden Palace, the emperor stayed with her every day. Naturally, no one would have the daring to offend the dignity of the royal family. Now that I think about it, back then, Consort May was probably young and muddle-headed. She only asked for the emperor's favor and probably made a mistake. Fortunately, later on, it was a mistake that prevented any major trouble." Lin Wan sighed. "I really don't know what she was thinking. She was young and didn't understand. It is still her father and brother's family who sold her into the palace for glory. I'm afraid this was the idea of her family." Fan Ruoro smiled coldly. "Her family is only a small one. Additionally, there hasn't been a consort in the palace for many years, so they probably don't know the taboo. How could they be so daring? Consort May's death has nothing to do with them." Hearing this, Lin Wan finally understood and guessed. However, she still didn't dare believe her ears. In a daze, she said, although it was a crime of deceiving the ruler, she had just given birth to a prince and didn't do anything rebellious. How could she have died for no reason? Who knows what the emperor was thinking in his heart? A faint worry rose between Fan Ruoro's brows. It was just hard on the child who lost his mother right after he was born. In the Qing kingdom, many years ago, there was also a child who lost his mother right after he was born. However, he still grew up healthily and happily under his mother's legacy. However, it was clear that Consort May, who was shone coldly by the midday sun, could not be like Yi Qing Mei, standing in the darkness and watching over her son. Chapter 763. What was written today was still the same. The murderous aura was gradually becoming apparent. The Qing kingdom had been very harmonious these days. A new prince had been born in the palace. This was a joyous event. As for how Consort Mei had died, no one dared to open their mouth and discuss it. The midwife in the palace had died because of Consort Mei's difficult birth and was buried with her. It was expected and expected. The Qing court was using troops in the north. The situation of the country was tense, and it was the day to unify the world. Who would be so daring as to say a few forbidden sentences? Were they not afraid that the internal court eunuchs and ascetic monks in the dark would report them? In just a few days, the matter of Consort Mei faded. Jingdo once again transformed into a bright moon, cool breeze, and deep autumn land. The battle in the north was still lingering. The winter snow gradually arrived, but the Qing kingdom's attacks did not weaken. They attacked straight north, and were about to approach the Nanjing defense line that the northern Qi people had laid out for 20 years. Unfortunately, after Shang Shanhu, who had remained in the Song kingdom and obtained the full trust of the northern Qi emperor, he coldly suppressed his troops without moving. He stood firmly on the Qing army's path of advance, making the Qing military incomparably fearful. In the end, Shi Fei still went to the north. Because of the urgency of the battle, Jingdo felt a slight sense of solemnity. This old Yanjing general, who had once subdued the northern camp, had been sent to the north by the emperor to assist Commander Wang Jikuan and be responsible for the northern expedition. Famous generals were like beauties. Presumably, when Shi Fei embarked on his journey, his heart was filled with lofty sentiments and lofty aspirations. With Shi Fei's departure, the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison became vacant again. It attracted the burning gazes of countless young and powerful figures in the military. However, the emperor's following edict immediately extinguished all hopes. Yuan formally left his staff work in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Other than his position as a martial tutor, he also took on the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison. No one dared to object to this appointment. There was not even the slightest bit of opinion. The great achievements Yuan had made in the western side of the empire this year had truly fallen into the eyes of the officials and commoners. No one could stop him from standing out. Decades ago, Yuan's father, Yizhong, had taken up the position of commander of the Jingdo garrison when he was very young. Now, the wheel of fortune had turned, and it had once again turned to the son he did not like. In the eyes of outsiders, the so-called tiger son of a general family, the pillar of the manor, was nothing more than this. At noon in late autumn, the clear and cold sunlight landed on Yuan's plain light armor. The young general furrowed his brows slightly. He gently squeezed his horse's abdomen and slowly walked outside Jingdo's Xingyang gate. He squinted his eyes and kept looking at the commoners that passed by him. He was like a falcon looking for its prey in the vast grassland. In reality, this was just his subconscious reaction to his true emotions. He did not have the extravagant hope of meeting Sir Fan Jr. here. He only longed to see that legendary figure. Although the emperor had strictly ordered that if he saw Fan Xian, he had to take 3 steps back, how could Yuan be willing? In the clear and spacious late autumn sky, the clear and cold sunlight turned into countless straight and curved rays of light. Yuan's eyes narrowed even more. A few wrinkles that did not match his age squeezed out at the corners of his slightly dark face. He silently thought of the conversation he had with the emperor that day in front of Taiji Palace. His emotions were unusually complicated. Why had he chosen to carry out the northern expedition in autumn? Was he not worried about the cold winter that was about to arrive? This was a question that the northern Qi ruler and officials did not understand. It was also the worry of the Qing officials. However, with the emperor's strict edict, the entire world had danced and warhorses galloped on the road to invade the northern court. No one dared to ask too much. The strangest thing was that they clearly knew that the timing for this battle was not right. Yet, not a single one of the important officials in the Bureau of Military Affairs that Yi Zhong led, the one who knew the most about war matters, chose to remonstrate with the emperor. Tens of thousands of soldiers have advanced wave after wave and stepped onto the path of no return just to force him to show himself. Yuan sat on his horse with his head slightly lowered. It was as if he wanted to avoid the not burning sunlight. A slightly pained smile rose to the corners of his lips. He didn't understand why the emperor thought so highly of Fan Xian. He also didn't understand whether or not it was right for the emperor to have the Qin kingdom's soldiers pay such a heavy price in order to lure and kill Fan Xian. When General Yuan sighed in his heart, he didn't know that the person he wanted to kill, the person the Qing emperor worried about the most in this land, had already passed through the city gates and returned to Jingdou. However, the city gate the two of them had gone through was not Jingyang Gate. The midday sun shone brightly at the western city gate. Among the busy stream of people going to and fro in Jingdou, there were two figures that did not draw much attention. One of them wore normal cloth clothing, while the other wore a straw hat. Fan Xian, who had put on a small disguise, unconsciously turned his head to glance at Wu Zhu beside him the moment he stepped into Jingdou. The wide straw hat blocked all of the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face in the shadows. No one should have noticed anything strange. Many years ago, Yi Qingmei had brought the young-looking Wu Zhu to the Qin kingdom's Jingdou like they were on a vacation. She had walked past the Jingdou city gates guarded by Yi Zhong and beaten Yi Zhong into a pig's head. Then, she had begun to assist a man in beginning his magnificent life. Fan Xian had brought the indifferent Wu Zhu back to the Qin kingdom's Jingdou without a sound. They had avoided Jingyang Gate, which Yuan personally guarded, and merged into the stream of people like two ghosts, preparing to begin the end of that man's magnificent life. From here on out it seemed to be a perfect cycle. When Fan Xian and Wu Zhu returned to Jingdou, the battle in the north was still continuing. A number of days had passed since Consort Mei's death. Although he was a rebel of the Qin kingdom and had been stripped of all official positions and power, he still had his powerful intelligence network. In an inn in Jingdou, Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought about the cause of Consort Mei's death. He analyzed his plans and gradually grew heavy. In the following days, Fan Xian disguised himself as the common green-clothed servant in Jingdou and wandered between manors, streets, and tea shop. He didn't go to find anyone he knew because he didn't want to be beaten and killed by tens of thousands of people. He was only carefully looking for something. He was looking for the chest, the heavy chest. Feng Shuetian's assassination attempt had failed, and he had been surrounded by the Qin army in the square in front of the palace. He had heard the sound of the chest and knew that the emperor had almost died to that heavy sniper rifle. If he could find the chest, perhaps the rest of the matter would be much simpler. However, whose hands would the chest be in? This question should have been the simplest and clearest to ask Wu Zhu. Presently, Wu Zhu was just a pale and indifferent piece of paper. He didn't remember anything and didn't care about anything. He only unconsciously followed Fan Xian out of the temple and began to wander around the world outside the temple, experiencing and experiencing. During those days, for the safety of his family and the understanding he had with the emperor, Fan Xian did not return to the Fan Manor. He searched for traces near Zhaixing Tower and thought hard about who would have Uncle Wu Zhu's greatest trust, other than himself. However, his train of thought had sunk into the wrong area. No matter what, he did not think of that woman. Thus, this kind of search appeared hesitant and directionless. He wanted to cry out on the late autumn streets of Jingdou. After all, he was the common enemy of the entire Qin court. In Jingdou, which appeared peaceful and without the smell of war, but was actually beginning to seep with a solemn aura, the most important task was to survive and hide his tracks. He didn't even dare make contact with his old subordinates in the Overwatch Council, so this kind of search appeared futile. The present Jingdo was already different from the Jingdo of a year ago. The Overwatch Council had become the illegitimate child raised by his second mother, swaying in the bleak wind and bitter rain. If it were not for the fact that the Emperor had not completely gone senile, the officials would have long suggested the Emperor directly disband the Overwatch Council. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that with the 3 treasures in his body, he could go anywhere in the world. Thus, no matter what kind of danger he encountered after his rebirth, he had never truly lost confidence. Even when facing Yi Liuyun's sword and the Emperor's finger, he still felt that he was the most ruthless person in the world. His 3 treasures were the poisoned crossbow, the poisoned dagger, and Uncle Wu Zhu. Presently, Uncle Wu Zhu had become an idiot. The chest had also disappeared. What could he do? Fan Manor, Duke Lu Manor, King Jing Manor, Yen Manor, Prince Huqing Manor, the Overwatch Council on Tianhe River, a yamen by the Supreme Court, a small manor in the south of the city. All of the places Fan Xian could have come into contact with had the court's spies. A number of times, Fan Xian almost ran into the ascetic monks wearing the straw hat. Since he couldn't figure out where the chest was, then he didn't think about it. Fan Xian was such a ruthless person. Compared to that, confirming the Emperor's current physical and mental state was the most important. Although there were intelligence reports gathered in his hands, he did not completely trust them. The Emperor in the palace was best at enduring, lying, and killing. It was like this at Dong Mountain. It had been like this many times. Fan Xian didn't want to make a mistake because he knew the Emperor would never give him another chance to make a mistake. Strangely, the Emperor and Fan Xian could not completely sort out each other's emotions. However, once they thought of each other, their emotions would calm and cool down. All that was left was to kill. There was no need to say it to anyone or announce it to the sun and moon. Killing each other seemed to have become some sort of spiritual support for the two of them to live in this world. It had to be said that this was a rather sorrowful matter. In order to obtain the truest information in the palace, Fan Xian thought for a long time in the inn and chose the Yi Manor. The Yi Manor was a loyal family. Yi Zhong was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, and Yi Wan was the commander of the Jingdo garrison. The Emperor trusted them to the extreme, so he would not send spies to keep watch. In the present world, there were not many places that could stop Fan Xian from sneaking in. Thus, when the worried Yi Linger suddenly saw a green-clothed manservant appear like a ghost in front of her, her expression changed dramatically. However, this brave girl of a family of generals was not a weak woman. She did not call out to him. Instead, her expression darkened. She pulled out the knife at her waist and, without hesitation, chopped down. "It's me," Fan Xian said. A tired smile rose to the corners of his lips. "It's you." Yi Linger looked in disbelief at his unfamiliar face and couldn't speak for a long time. She had not thought that this young teacher would still be alive and able to come back alive from the temple. After talking for a while, Fan Xian tiredly lowered his head. It looked like the Emperor's health was truly failing. Furthermore, from Consort Mei's death and the royal family's arrangements for the little prince, his heart moved slightly. With unusual accuracy, he grasped the Emperor's thoughts and emotions. It was a faint sense of old age. It looked like the powerful Emperor had successively suffered heavy blows from his closest son and official. Not only his body, but even his spirit had sunk into the lowest period of his life. Why had the Emperor chosen this time to begin the northern expedition? Was it because he felt that he didn't have much time left, so he needed to hurry? In order to knock the Emperor off his divine altar, Fan Xian had not hesitated to use spears, swords, and people's hearts. He had used the shameless thoughts he had cultivated in 2 lifetimes to use the world as a threat and the people as a threat. Only then had he finally succeeded in creating the present situation. The Emperor was old and had emotions. Naturally, he was weak. This was the situation he had been most looking forward to seeing. Why did Fan Xian not feel a glimmer of joy in his heart? Not only was Fan Xian not happy, on the contrary, he was perplexed. He sat in the chair in front of Yi Linger with both feet on the surface of the chair. His hands were wrapped around his knees, and his face was pressed against his legs. He silently sank into thought, giving off a feeling of unusual exhaustion. Yi Linger saw his posture. Her eyes lit up slightly and then quickly turned into a deep sorrow. She thought of someone. Perhaps it was because she thought of someone that she did not ask Fan Xian where the other person was. The sun gradually moved toward the west. A patch of twilight shone on the Yi Manor. Yuan stepped into the back garden with a heavy expression. Perhaps it was because of the tense battle in the north, or because the entire Jingdo was on guard against the return of that person. The palace did not strictly order him to leave the capital and return to camp. On the contrary, the emperor had left an oral order for him to follow the yamen to investigate matters. His father, Yi Zhong, should still be in the Bureau of Military Affairs analyzing military reports and drawing up strategies. He would probably have to stay up all night. Yuan did not feel a glimmer of envy or resentment. He knew better than anyone that although the northern expedition had already begun, it could not end in a short time because there was still an important goal that had not been reached. It was precisely because Yi Zhong was not in the manner that Yuan's footsteps appeared lighter. His relationship with his father had always been poor. Otherwise, he would not have stayed in Nanzhao for so many years. Even the people of Jingdo had almost forgotten about his existence. However, Yuan and Yi Linger's relationship was very good. Perhaps it was because they had not seen each other for many years, but the brother and sister seemed particularly close. Yuan prepared to go to the back garden to see his sister, so he did not bring any subordinates or guards. However, the moment he entered the back garden, the first thing he saw was not his sister's figure. Instead, it was a green-clothed servant. The green-clothed servant bowed humbly with his back hunched and prepared to leave. However, Yuan narrowed his eyes. The moment he entered the garden, he had already noticed that there was something wrong with the position of this strangely ordinary green-clothed servant's feet. This was a very fine place. The green-clothed servant's feet appeared casual, but Yuan knew that as long as this person moved his back foot, his entire body would be able to rise. Of course, this was an ability that only aces of their level could have. Was he too vigilant? The cold light in Yuan's narrowed eyes gradually froze. He looked at the back of the green-clothed servant who brushed past him and suddenly asked, "Why did you come back?" The green-clothed servant's figure paused slightly and slowly stopped his steps. He then turned around with unusual calmness and looked at the young master of the Yi Manor. With great interest he asked, "Yuan? Even like this, you could see through me. Although it was because I was careless, you are indeed not bad." When Fan Xian unexpectedly ran into Yuan in the Yi Manor, Wu Zhu, who had entered the capital with him, was wearing the large bamboo hat and strolling through Jingdo. When it came to the present Wu Zhu, Fan Xian no longer knew what words to use to describe his feeling of defeat. This forever 15-year-old young warrior covered in black cloth had not only lost his memory, he had even forgotten much of the knowledge of survival in this world. Fan Xian had stayed in Jingdo for many days. Wu Zhu had also stayed by the window of the inn for many days. Although the black cloth covered his eyes, Fan Xian always felt that he could see the desire and curiosity in his eyes. Wu Zhu still did not speak and remained silent like a pale walking machine. He only unconsciously followed Fan Xian's footsteps. Fortunately, Fan Xian was most skilled in dealing with idiotic children. De Bao was coaxed well by him, and Wu Zhu was no exception. Along the way, there were no major problems. However, the body that seemed to have lost its soul always made Fan Xian's heart ache uncontrollably. Thus, he no longer stopped Wu Zhu from leaving the inn and strolling. Truthfully speaking, he could not stop him. As long as Wu Zhu could remember the way back to the inn, it was fine. Fan Xian was also not worried about Wu Zhu's safety. In his opinion, there was no one in this world who could harm him. However, Fan Xian seemed to have forgotten that right now Wu Zhu was like an ignorant and curious child. Even more troublesome was that Wu Zhu's brain did not have the slightest possibility of harming humans. Thus, the black-clothed Wu Zhu seemed to be at ease in Jingdo, but in reality, he was strolling dangerously. He did not attack and did not care about anything. He only watched through the black cloth, looking at this strange yet familiar city. Wu Zhu walked through the streets and alleys, looking curiously at the candied haws and listening to the people in the tea shops passionately discussing the war situation in the north. He walked through the long alley, crossed the Tianhe River, and came to the edge of the square of the royal palace. He tilted his head curiously and looked through the black cloth at the glorious front gate of the royal palace. For some reason, a thread of irrepressible irritation rose in his icy heart. Smack! A small stone smashed into his body, followed by many more. The children in Jingdo had no idea that the man wearing the straw hat was the most dangerous existence in the world. They desperately smashed him with stones. Throwing idiots! Throwing idiots! Wu Zhu did not move at all, allowing the children to throw stones. He looked at the front gate of the royal palace and suddenly said to himself, "This seems to be called the Meridian Gate. It's used to kill people." Chapter 764. I don't want to say anything. A faint sense of disappointment is beginning to creep in. Am I not a petty bourgeois? In the back garden of the Yi Manor, Yi Wan's pupils constricted slightly as he stared unblinkingly at the green-clothed servant. He had not thought that after he had exposed his location, the other party would have the courage to turn around and face him directly instead of choosing to leap over the wall and leave at the first opportunity. Fan Xian calmly turned around. There was only calmness in his eyes. There was not a glimmer of any other emotion. He looked at the unfamiliar young general in front of him and immediately identified the other party's identity. There were only two men in the Yi family, old and young, who could come to Yi Linger's little garden without being announced. Since the other party was not Yi Zhong, then it was General Yi Wan, who had risen to prominence this year and received the respect of countless Qing soldiers. If this had been a year ago or even longer ago, Fan Xian and Yi Wan, the two most valiant young men in the Qing kingdom, might have developed a feeling of mutual appreciation and uncontrollably affection. It would be just like how Fan Xian and the great prince had at first had a grudge. In the end, they grew closer because of their personalities. However, it was impossible now. Presently, Fan Xian was a traitor of the Qing kingdom and an unpardonable criminal. Yi Wan was a rising star general and the emperor's most trusted figure of the younger generation. Most importantly, Fan Xian had experienced a long journey through the snowy plains. He seemed to have seen everything in the world lightly. There was only calmness and indifference in his eyes. This kind of calmness and indifference represented powerful confidence. In Yi Wan's eyes, it was a powerful disdain. The glimmer of dissatisfaction and anger hidden in his heart for a number of days immediately took over his entire body. This anger did not make his judgment deviate at all. It only made him even more calm. Fan Xian is here. Yi Wan roared. Although he very much hoped to have a fair battle with Fan Xian, he would not make such a mistake. For the Qing court, Fan Xian was like a fishbone that could not be swallowed. Being able to capture him or kill him was what Yi Wan wanted to do the most. The emperor had once said that if this person did not die, it would be difficult for the emperor's heart to rest. As an official, Yi Wan had to suppress his pride. Thus, after he let out a roar to inform the soldiers outside the garden, he immediately chose to retreat. Using such a weak stance, he blocked Fan Xian's path of retreat. He did not mind using such a humiliating method to buy more time. As long as the soldiers arrived and Jingdo sounded the alarm, Yi Wan did not believe Fan Xian could escape. Fan Xian also understood this. When Yuan opened his mouth coldly, he had already leapt forward. Fan Xian pounced forward like a streak of smoke. Although it was gentle, the gentle shadow carried a heart-chilling tyranny. It tore through the cold autumn air and the peace of the garden. The powerful and tyrannical aura that pounced toward him made Yuan, who had retreated 3 steps, narrow his eyes. It was as if he felt the wind in front of him piercing his bones like an icy knife. His heart was shocked, but his expression remained calm and unchanging. Without time to draw his knife, his hands crossed in front of him. His left fist and right palm intersected. In a very short time, he valiantly formed a hand bridge and sealed the front. Once the hand bridge appeared, it was like a metal chain crossing a river. A murderous and powerful aura rose spontaneously and blocked in front of Fan Xian's punch. It made the tyrannical punch like a floating log on the river. Although it came with ferocious momentum, it did not give off the feeling that it could shatter the metal chain. Fan Xian was in midair, but his eyes had already narrowed. He had practiced the Yi family's coffin breaker technique for many years and was very familiar with the Yi family's martial arts. However, Yuan had retreated 3 steps and appeared weak. Unexpectedly, the hand bridge formed and a thick wall appeared in the air. Such a powerful and exquisite hand seal was definitely not part of the coffin breaker technique. Was it Yi Liuyun's Sanzhou? Had this young general learned the ultimate skill left behind by a great grandmaster? Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly, but his hands did not slow down at all. The aura emanating from the hand bridge in front of him was too powerful. He knew that his tyrannical punch might not be able to break through the other party's defense. The power of flowing cloud Sanzhou lay in the impermanence of its true form. Once the other party's hand bridge sealed his own, the following changing counterattack would probably be faster than his. More importantly, flowing cloud Sancho's counterattack was like the floating clouds on the horizon. It was difficult for anyone to catch its true form. Even if Fan Xian was not afraid, if he was actually sealed by flowing cloud Sanzhou, he would probably not be able to retreat for a moment. It was clear that Yuan wanted to capture or kill him. He would not mind delaying him and then joining forces with others to attack. With a whoosh like a magic trick, a black, delicate crossbow bolt suddenly shot out from Fan Xian's sleeve. It surpassed the speed of his fist and shot into Yuan's hand bridge with a thud. This move was very sinister. Fan Xian had always been a sinister person. However, this thud clearly had a problem. The delicate poisoned crossbow bolt seemed to have shot into wood. It only left a small red dot on Yuan's calloused but still pure white hands before it fell down dejectedly. After Yi Liuyun's Sanzhou had been practiced to the extreme, he could catch Sigujian's ruthless strike. His nephew, Yuan, clearly did not have such a realm. Faced with Fan Xian's sinister crossbow bolt, he appeared unusually valiant. After the black light there was a streak of bright light. With a hiss, Fan Xian's tightly clenched fist suddenly opened. A black dagger stabbed down viciously. Yuan's expression remained calm. He did not move at all. His 2 hands, 1 fist and 1 palm, became soft in front of the black dagger. They turned into 2 balls of clouds in the sky and gently stuck to the side of Fan Xian's black dagger. It made it seem as if Fan Xian's thousands of tyrannical forces had plunged into a swamp of cotton and did not raise a single ripple. No matter how strong he was, this was Fan Xian's first time encountering the Yi family's true bright moon, great river, and cool breeze. He was unable to advance an inch. Fan Xian's right foot stomped heavily on the stone floor between the 2 of them. With a crack, the stone floor shattered like a spiderweb. His expression did not change. The index finger of his right hand curled cleverly. Using a small trick, the black dagger followed the tip of his finger and drew a sharp arc. The 2 of them were already very close. Yuan had nowhere to retreat. Fan Xian had to break out. Both of them had raised their cultivation to the peak in an instant. The black dagger, which carried a mournful force, slashed down. Yi Wan's hands suddenly turned into two old trees. The leafless branches opened up one by one and swiftly collided with the black dagger dozens of times. However, not a single wound was left on his withered fingers. In this instant, the corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched. He smiled slightly. There was only calmness in his smile, as well as the confidence this calmness represented, as well as the power this confidence represented. The black dagger at the tip of his finger slashed down dozens of times. They were all blocked, but he used the momentum to pull the dagger back. His left hand, which had been hanging calmly by his waist, clenched tightly into a fist. He did not give it any exquisite angle or incorporate any technique taught by a great grandmaster. He only smashed it forward viciously. With a muffled bang, Fan Xian's left fist smashed viciously into the hand bridge that Yi Wan had rearranged in an instant. The battle between the two powerful young men had already progressed to a contest of martial cultivation foundations. Fan Xian abandoned all external emotions and technique. Completely unreasonable, he forcefully fought the zhenqi in his body against Yi Wan's. The fist and palm collided without any hindrance. Yi Wan's expression darkened slightly and then paled in an instant. His left foot stepped behind him and his hands blocked in front of him. His entire body formed a beautiful arrow-shaped figure. His back foot was like a nail nailed firmly into the rock. His two hands were like a metal plate, blocking any attack that came charging at him. Fan Xian's body remained relaxed and casual. It was as if he had thrown out a punch without thinking in his anger. His 2 feet were still in place, and his body was still not in a proper shape. A powerful ripple spread out from the bodies of the 2 people in the garden. With a whoosh, the autumn wind kicked up, sending up countless pieces of rock and fallen leaves. Fan Xian's eyes lit up as he stared at Yi Wan's dark and stern face, which was close at hand. It seemed that he had not expected the zhenqi in Yi Wan's body to be so powerful. After consecutively sealing his 2 hidden attacks, Yi Wan was still able to block the tyrannical punch. He had been accumulating power for a long time. Just how did Yi Wan train such powerful and solid zhenqi in his body? Had this person been training his spirit and willpower without sleep when he had been exiled to Nanzhao? Thinking of this, Fan Xian faintly felt some admiration for him. However, the sound of footsteps came from outside the garden. Fan Xian did not want to waste any more time. Fan Xian was slightly startled. He did not know that across from him, the shock in Yi Wan's heart was even more difficult to express. Yi Wan knew how powerful he was, but faced with Fan Xian's seemingly casual punch, he had the inauspicious thought that his hand bridge would be destroyed. The reason he had this thought was purely because Yi Wan was in the field and could clearly feel Fan Xian's strength, which was even more powerful and tyrannical than the legends. In this moment, Yi Wan finally understood where Sir Fan Jr.'s reputation had come from. He also finally understood why the Emperor had ordered him to take 3 steps back the moment he saw Fan Xian. If Yi Wan had not taken 3 steps back earlier and set up his hand bridge first, given Fan Xian's ability to react to situations, his strength, and the ruthlessness of his attacks, he would probably have destroyed Yi Wan's state of mind with 3 consecutive attacks in an instant. He would not have given Yi Wan the opportunity to use the flowing cloud release hand. Was he truly not as good as him? Although Yi Wan's expression remained steady and calm, his heart was filled with a powerful impulse to carry out a final battle with the other party. Fan Xian did not give Yi Wan this opportunity. Although it was impossible for him to kill the other party in one move, he decided to leave an unforgettable impression on him and leave behind a satisfactory ending for this first encounter between the 2 of them that was destined to be passed down to future generations. Thus, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. The clothes on his body began to rustle and tremble in the autumn wind. A faint but endless yuanqi moved along the autumn wind, through the holes in his clothes, and along every inch of his skin. It began to pour endlessly into his body. Fan Xian closed his eyes, hiding the unusual bright light in them. With a muffled grunt, his left arm swelled up. His fist, which had lost all its momentum, spat out all of its strength. The dam made of sand and stone blocked thousands of li of the vast river water. The river water rose higher and higher, and the force of the water increased. Suddenly, the heavens were not on their side. It rained heavily. Countless raindrops scattered into the river. In an instant, a breach appeared in the dam. A large hall that was about to collapse was held up by countless thick and straight logs, barely holding up the existence of the palace. However, the earth began to shake. An energy that had not been there before but had suddenly appeared shook the earth and shook the foundations of the logs, causing them to fall one by one. The hall lost its support and collapsed with a bang. From the beginning, he had used the Yi family's flowing cloud sans ho and the ceiling hand gesture to form a hand bridge to successfully block Fan Xian's 3 consecutive attacks. Yuan did not feel any pride, even if he was facing the powerful Fan Xian. That was because he knew best how powerful he was. However, he suddenly felt that the bridge his 2 hands had formed had been destroyed. His body, the hall, was about to collapse. So, Fan Xian's power was above the legends and above his own judgment. A gust of autumn wind brushed past. The withered leaves that had been blown about by the 2 people's strength began to dance again. Amidst the dancing leaves, Fan Xian's unusually steady fist broke through the Yi family's flowing cloud Sancho's hand bridge, like breaking dry weeds and smashing viciously into Yuan's right chest. The autumn wind rose again, and the leaves flew again. There was no trace of Fan Xian in the back garden of the Yi family. There was only a pale-faced Yuan holding his chest and forcefully swallowing the mouthful of fresh blood that had surged to his lips. The bodyguards had finally charged into the garden, but they did not see any trace of the enemy. They only saw that the usually undefeated General Yi seemed to have lost. From the moment Yuan saw the green-clothed servant to the moment the bodyguards charged into the garden, only 10 seconds had passed. In these 10 seconds, the 2 important figures who would influence the future of the Qin kingdom had met for the first time in their lives and determined a victor. Yuan held his chest and forcefully calmed the almost boiling zhenqi in his body. Killing intent quickly returned to his eyes. In an icy voice, he said, "Inform the palace that Fan Xian has returned." With these words, the bodyguards finally knew who had defeated the general they saw as a god of death. Shocked expressions appeared on everyone's faces. Yuan slowly turned around and looked with narrowed eyes at the high wall that Fan Xian had jumped out from earlier. His emotions were unusually complicated. It was an emotion of anger and dissatisfaction. In the earlier battle, as an official, his first thought was to keep the other party here. Thus, from the beginning, he had adopted a defensive stance. His aura had fallen to a disadvantage, so he was dissatisfied in his heart. If the scene had been changed, perhaps it would have been much better. Fan Xian's last punch had been able to easily break through the bridge of his hand. Although it was impossible for Fan Xian's tyrannical zhenqi to have much destructive power after breaking through the flowing cloud release, being defeated and injured by the other party was an undeniable reality. In particular, the powerful zhenqi that had surged out of the punch at the end made Yuan understand one reality. He was indeed not a match for Fan Xian. Yuan never underestimated his enemies, particularly someone as famous as Fan Xian. However, he had not thought that the strength Fan Xian had demonstrated was more powerful than the legends, military intelligence, and his own predictions. A cough rang out. Yuan used the corner of his sleeve to wipe away the blood at the side of his lip. His eyes were icy cold and unusually angry. The reason for his anger was because why was life so unfair? Ever since he was young, he had traveled between the yellow sand and the barbarians in the south. His diligence in cultivation was second to no one else in the world. That was why he had his current superior 9th-level strength. However, it did not seem to be enough for Fan Xian. This was impossible. Fan Xian had not lived much longer than him. How could he have cultivated to such a realm? A genius? Could having a genius surpass his diligence? Fan Xian did not know of the anger of the young general in the Yi manor behind him. Even if he knew, he probably would not understand. He knew better than anyone that he was not a genius in martial cultivation. It was just that his luck was good. Furthermore, he was more diligent than anyone else. When all was said and done, he and Yi Wan walked the same path. However, from the moment Fan Xian was born, he had begun to cultivate the tyrannical martial method. From the first day he was alive, he began to fear death. No one in the world could compare to this kind of pressure and feeling. Thus, it created his strange realm. He had defeated Yi Wan but was unable to kill him. There was not a glimmer of pride in Fan Xian's heart. His confidence, based on his powerful strength, had already allowed him to transcend certain boundaries. In today's battle, he had used his strength to break through. It appeared simple, but it was a return to simplicity and a wonderful choice. He lowered his head and shook off the gradually rising commotion in Jingdo. Silently, he returned to the inn. He then saw the silent Uncle Wu Zhu. He was not looking at the scenery by the window. Instead, he had his head lowered as if thinking about something. When humans thought, God laughed. If Wu Zhu began to think, who would laugh? Fan Xian gently coughed and coughed up the bloody phlegm that had come out of his injury from Yi Wan's hand bridge earlier. Looking at Uncle Wu Zhu, he said, "He knows I've returned. I will enter the palace tonight." Although he knew there was not much meaning in saying these words, for some reason, Fan Xian was still used to telling Uncle Wu Zhu everything he did. It was just like that day and night in front of the snowy temple when he coughed up blood and talked. As expected, Wu Zhu did not have any reaction. He only lowered his head. Fan Xian's head also gradually lowered. The night gradually darkened. There was no light in the room in the inn. There was only darkness and two people. At the first glimmer of dawn the next day, the room in the inn was already empty. The unlit candles still maintained their delicate appearance. There were no sticky tears shed to mourn in advance the revenge that was about to begin and end. Not long after midnight, Fan Xian changed into a eunuch's clothes and slipped into the darkness of Jingdo. Before he left the inn, he gave Uncle Wu Zhu one last deep glance. He did not try to wake him or invite him to join in the conflict of human emotions. Wu Zhu also did not seem to mind his departure. He just waited alone until daybreak. The moment the sky brightened, rain began to fall in Jingdo in the depths of autumn and the beginning of winter. The icy rainwater pattered against the transparent glass windows and blossomed into flower after flower on the surface. It was rain, not snow, but it appeared particularly cold. The cold rain did not grow heavier. It only fell in strands, striking against the tiles of the private residences in Jingdo. In the small stone alleys and beside the little bridges and flowing water, a rich, slow, and beautiful melody rang out. All of the private residences in Jingdo bathed in the cold rain had windows. Ever since the palace treasury had revived, the price of glass in the court had plummeted. Most of these windows were made of glass. Thus, when the cold rain fell on the world, it would blossom into flowers of different sizes on the glass. Wu Zhu, covered by a black cloth, sat quietly by the window, looking at the rain blooming on the glass. After a long silence, he suddenly extended a finger and gently touched the glass. It seemed that he wanted to touch the beautiful flower outside the window but was helplessly separated by the glass. "This is glass." Wu Zhu suddenly broke the silence. Alone, he looked out the window. Without a trace of emotion, he said, "I made it." Wu Zhu sat for a long time. Then he stood up and silently looked out the window. It seemed that he remembered that it was time for him to go shopping, so he turned and pushed open the door to leave the room. He walked down the stairs and out of the inn into the icy rain. There were many spots of dirt on his clothes. They were marks left by a Jingdo urchin in an alley yesterday afternoon. He had been in a heavy mood all night and had not noticed this. No one would go shopping in the rain. Perhaps there were couples who liked to play around, holding umbrellas and walking in the rain, but there was no such thing in this world. Scholars held umbrellas and sang poems in the rain. Wu Zhu walked in the rain, covered in black cloth and clothed in plain clothes. Who knew how many people who were hiding from the rain looked at him in amazement. The icy rain soaked through Wu Zhu's clothes and swallowed up the dirty spots of mud. He walked silently and alone in the rain, passing through the streets and alleys of Jingdo. He allowed the rain to soak his forever black and beautiful hair, as well as the black cloth that had been covered by thousands of years of wind and frost. Chapter 765. The late autumn rain gradually grew heavier. Wu Zhu walked out of the alley in the rain, under the strange gazes of the passers-by, and came to a small fork in the road beside the Tianhe River. The wet rainwater flowed down his clothes and slowly dripped down the black cloth on his face. He stopped here and then raised his head slightly, looking at the distant imperial palace in the misty rain. Yesterday afternoon, Wu Zhu had also spent half a day looking at the royal palace. Although he came from the temple and had unconsciously followed Fan Xian to see the world of mortals, the royal palace was indeed the most worthwhile place to visit in the capital. It was the most magnificent building, but Wu Zhu had come here 2 days in a row. Presumably, some other opportunity had influenced his decision. Under the eaves on the side of the street, a few urchins in cotton-padded jackets were carrying square school bags. They rubbed their hands against the cold, their faces pale from the cold. Every day, these children went to the public school set up by the court to study, and they all carried umbrellas with them. But when they reached the mouth of the alley, the rain suddenly grew heavier. "Look, it's that idiot from yesterday." One of the children thought that the rain was too boring. Although it seemed that they could delay class, who would want to bow their head under someone else's roof? At that moment, he discovered Wu Zhu, standing woodenly in the rain like an idiot. He recognized him as the idiot who had allowed himself to be abused by him the day before, and was as happy as if he had discovered a new continent. There were no stones under the eaves, and the urchins rolled their eyes. Next to a coal stove, they found some bits of coal that had not completely burned out the night before. With shrill laughter and yelling, they began to throw them at Wu Zhu. For some reason, it seemed that when humans were very young, they were very good at bullying people weaker than themselves to prove their strength, and thus obtain some sort of spiritual satisfaction. This seemed to be a kind of innate nature. Otherwise, why would the children feel joy when they heard the bits of coal falling on Wu Zhu's body? Why would they feel joy when they saw Wu Zhu's body smashed and dirty? There were not many people hiding from the rain on the street. In the eyes of these few Jingdo commoners, the blind man standing in the rain in a daze was clearly an idiot and a handicapped person. They couldn't help but feel some sympathy, but when they saw the stains on the blind man's body, they unconsciously felt some disgust. Therefore, other than a woman who looked like an auntie, who fiercely scolded those little brats, no one else did anything. They just watched indifferently as those disapproving children used their own methods to vent their violent desires that were inherent in all life. With a smack, a lump of coal soaked in water ruthlessly smashed into Wu Zhu's motionless and expressionless face. It made a crisp sound, as if he had been slapped in the face. That piece of coal knocked the black cloth off Wu Zhu's face a little. Wu Zhu's pale face also tilted a little, as if he did not quite understand what had happened. Then, he straightened the black cloth on his face and slowly turned around to look at the children under the eaves whose hands were not clean. The urchins were not afraid, because they had smashed him all afternoon yesterday, and this blind idiot showed no signs of resistance. On the contrary, seeing that Wu Zhu had reacted today, they felt even more excited. The bits of coal that were smashed into the rain in the street suddenly became denser. Smack, smack, smack. Finally, someone found a stone. Mixed with the coal, they smashed it into Wu Zhu's head and face, leaving behind dirty marks and a few streaks of blood. Washed by the rain, they flowed on Wu Zhu's pale face like a flood after a dry season, carrying thousands of years of trash. On the face of the earth, they washed out frightening marks. Wu Zhu still did not dodge. Wu Zhu still did not dodge. It turned out that Wu Zhu could also be injured. Separated by the black cloth, he stared in a daze at the children who were laughing incessantly and waving their little hands. He did not understand why they wanted to attack him. He also did not understand why the innocent faces of these children could have such savage smiles. He also did not understand why the stones, regardless of whether they were sharp or round, smashed into his head or face. His heart felt somewhat strange. What kind of emotion was that? Sadness? Disappointment? Anger? Dissatisfaction? Or was it just emotion? Wu Zhu looked at the children and allowed them to smash him. Suddenly, in his muddled mind, there seemed to be something extra. The rain suddenly became heavy. It was as if someone had cut a large hole in the late autumn sky of the capital. Countless rivers, lakes, and seas poured down from that unfathomably deep hole, turning into a torrential downpour that filled the sky and scattered over the streets and on top of the homes. It was as if a large hole had suddenly opened in Wu Zhu's mind. Clear and unrestrained sunlight shone down, enveloping his entire body in a strange emotion. He had emotions. What did this prove? Was it the same as what the young man called Fan Xian said about curiosity? Wu Zhu began to think again. He thought silently in the boundless rain. The young man called Fan Xian had once said many things to him, but he did not understand. He could not understand. He could only remember it in his heart. What did the young man called Fan Xian do? It seemed that he went to the royal palace. It seemed to be for revenge. Why revenge? For whom? It seemed that someone had died. That was why the person called Fan Xian was dissatisfied and unhappy. It was a woman called Yi Qingmei and an old cripple called Chen Pingping. These two unfamiliar names seemed to become clearer and more familiar in Wu Zhu's mind along with the rain that filled the sky and the clear light that shone through the large hole. However, what gave him a headache was that he still could not remember who they were. Had he not been in the temple his entire life? Wu Zhu still couldn't remember anything, but he had something he shouldn't have had, and that was emotions. In fact, since yesterday afternoon, those emotions had already filled his heart, causing his eyes to only be separated by a black cloth as he quietly looked at the imperial palace. This emotion was called disgust. For some reason, Wu Zhu could not explain it. He loathed the tallest building in Jingdou. Perhaps it was because he instinctively loathed the people inside the building? When he left the snowy temple, the young man called Fan Xian coughed up blood and told him to follow his heart. But what was the heart? Was it the fresh and unfamiliar emotion he was feeling right now? Wu Zhu decided to go to the royal palace to have a look and find the true source of his emotions. He wanted to see if there was anyone inside he wanted to see, someone he was fated to see. Thus, he placed his hand steadily on the metal drill by his waist. At the same time, he lowered his head slightly and put on the bamboo hat on his back again. He blocked the rain from the sky and covered his eyes with the black cloth. However, the children were still happily throwing stones and coal debris. After a moment of silence, Wu Zhu let go of the iron drill in his hand and squatted down. His palm moved through the flowing sewage on the ground and grabbed a handful of coal debris that was not hard. He could not harm humans unless it was for the benefit of humanity as a whole. The biggest difference between Wu Zhu and the old man in the temple was that he did not understand what the benefit of humanity as a whole was and what it had to do with him. Perhaps those young humans were only playing a game. Wu Zhu thought so and reacted in this way. At least, he did not feel any disgust or anger toward these young humans who bullied and humiliated him. Since it was a game, he would play a game with them once. Perhaps they would stop bothering him like this. Wu Zhu directly threw the coal mixed with rainwater toward the children under the eaves by the side of the street. A wave of terrified cries, a wave of panicked footsteps, countless cries, and the sound of someone fainting in the rain fell to the ground. A mess of sounds followed Wu Zhu's actions. A handful of coal briquettes mixed with dirty water accurately split into 4 portions and accurately hit the bodies of the urchins. One of the urchins who laughed the loudest had his head smashed and blood oozed out. He fainted in the rain without making a sound. After a deathly silence, an angry roar suddenly exploded. An idiot killed someone! The previously cold and detached Jingdo commoners suddenly became outstanding citizens who were eager for justice. They reported to the officials and their parent. There were even some middle-aged men who took out wooden sticks and mops and prepared to beat the idiot to the ground. They were all neighbors. Naturally, they could not just watch as the children suffered so much. The mother of the child who had fainted on the ground threw herself on top of the child, crying loudly and cursing Wu Zhu with hatred. Wu Zhu watched all of this coldly. He still did not understand. If this was a game, why was the woman crying? If this was not a game, why did they not stop the children earlier? He knew that he would not be hurt. Did these humans also know that he was not normal? Did they not worry about his safety when the children beat him earlier? In the rain, the silent Wu Zhu vaguely learned a few things. He understood a little that human emotions had nothing to do with choice or reason. It turned out that it was divided by affection and disgust. In this world, Wu Zhu believed that the person closest to him should be that young man called Fan Xian. He hated the royal palace the most, so he no longer paid attention to these people who seemed to have gone mad. Very seriously, he smoothed out the wrinkles on the black cloth on his face again. Placing his hand on the metal drill at his waist, he stepped toward the royal palace in the distance. Someone tried to kill this idiot, blind, crazy person and then fainted on the ground. The wooden stick also broke in two. In the heavy rain, Wu Zhu, dressed in cotton clothes and wearing a straw hat, easily walked out of the angry crowd of Jingdo people, leaving behind only a ground of people crying out in pain. Wu Zhu did not kill anyone. It was not that he did not dare to, but it was a habit he had developed over hundreds of thousands of years. He did not kill when he did not want to, but when he wanted to, he would. When the bailiffs of the capital government arrived at the fork of the river, the madman who had beaten the people had long disappeared. Looking at the people crying out in pain in the rain, the leader of the bailiffs took a quick look and sucked in a breath of cold air. He wondered who this master was, to be able to act so cleanly and efficiently. How could a master disdain to make life difficult for these defenseless people? The leader of the bailiffs felt a chill, not because of the people's injuries, but because of the blind man who had disappeared. If, as the people said, that person was an idiot, then, without question, this idiot must be the most powerful martial madman in history. Having such a martial madman running around in the capital, the leader of the bailiffs was afraid. He immediately had his subordinates notify the yamen of the capital government, and then nervously asked the person next to him, "Where did that madman go?" "I think he went in the direction of the square," the person replied with a trembling voice. He gritted his teeth and said, "That person has been watching the palace for 2 days. I'm afraid there's something wrong." The leader of the bailiffs did not need to ask again to know that this person wanted to kill the madman. If anything involved the palace, there was no way out. But hearing that the martial madman was heading straight in the direction of the palace, the leader of the bailiffs felt a bit more relaxed. After all, there were many masters in the palace, and the imperial guards were strict. Even the most powerful martial madman could only be beaten to the ground. Even if the legendary Sir Fan came back, could he break into the palace? The rain continued to fall. Wu Zhu did not know how urgently the people on the street behind him wanted him dead. He also did not know that the leader of the bailiffs had already sentenced him to death. He only wore a straw hat and held a metal drill. Step by step, he walked toward the square of the palace with unusual stability and straightforwardness. In Langya County in northern Qi, the new cloth shoes Fan Xian had bought for him had long been soaked in the water. With each step, it was like a drum sounded in Wu Zhu's mind, pounding against his heart and soul. Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, Fan Xian, these names that seemed far away but were also close rang out endlessly in his mind. With each step, he faintly remembered something. Although it was not clear, it was particularly close. For example, this royal palace in the cold rain, this Jingdo filled with a familiar smell, and it was filled with glass he had made. It was so familiar. At the same time, as he approached the square of the imperial city, Wu Zhu's disgust for the imperial palace deepened. This majestic imperial city that stood in the storm was so unshakable, so strict and disgusting. Jingdo was an old place, and the royal palace was also an old place, Wu Zhu thought. Walking alone in the rain in an old place, he had to run into a road blocked by rain. The road was quiet and lonely, and he was too lazy to avoid it in the rain. What blocked Wu Zhu's path was people, not the rain. It was a group of imperial soldiers in full armor and full of murderous intent. The rain fell on the gray armor of these elite soldiers of the Qing military, making pitter-patter sounds. It fell on their solemn faces, but it did not stir up the slightest change in their emotions. The expression on Wu Zhu's face did not change in the slightest. His body continued to lean forward, allowing the bamboo hat on his head to block out the pouring rain. His feet did not slow down, nor did he speed up. He only steadily walked at a speed he was accustomed to, toward the center of the plaza. Wu Zhu wanted to enter the royal palace to have a look, so he had to pass through the main gate of the royal palace and walk through the square in the rain. For him, this was unusually simple logic. He did not care at all whether or not someone would stop him. For the imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace, his unusually simple logic appeared unusually cold and daring. The news of Fan Xian's return to the capital had already spread from the Yi Manor last night. Now, all of the upper echelons of the Qing kingdom knew of this shocking news. The royal palace had been under martial law since last night. Everything that entered was checked very strictly. The defense had also been raised to an unprecedented level of tension. Even on the day the Jingdo garrison had escorted the old director of the Overwatch Council back to the capital, the security in the royal palace had not been as tight as it was today. Everyone knew why Fan Xian had returned to the capital. He would certainly try to enter the palace again to assassinate the emperor. The Qing court would not give this rebel a second chance. The imperial army's patrol work extended out by a third of the area. There was a heavy rain this morning. The wet and cold feeling made everyone raise their guard. They also felt waves of fear. They didn't know where Fan Xian was or when he would kill his way into the palace. The small disturbance at the fork in the Tianhe Road had also fallen into the eyes of the imperial army. However, the soldiers responsible for the safety of the outer perimeter did not see the sudden incident of a martial madman as too important. However, when this blind martial madman wearing a conical hat suddenly displayed astonishing strength and began to silently walk toward the imperial palace, the imperial guards finally realized that something was amiss. When the cloth shoe on the blind man's right foot stepped onto the puddles of water on the stone slabs of the square, the imperial army gave their first warning. They began to gather their military power and prepare to capture him in one move. However, it was as if Wu Zhu did not hear the warning that was enough to chill the hearts of most people in the world. He continued to walk steadily and silently. Under the wary gaze of the imperial army on the palace walls and the cold and stern gaze of the imperial army soldiers in the square, he walked steadily step by step. After 3 warnings, the blind man in the heavy rain still acted as if he did not hear them and turned a blind eye to them. Step by step, he walked toward the center of the square toward the front gate of the royal palace. Even at this moment, the soldiers of the Imperial Army still believed that this strange person was a lunatic and did not associate him with an assassin. In the eyes of the common people, no matter how powerful an assassin, even Sigujien of the past, would not choose such an open and honorable method of assassination. Surrounded by tens of thousands of Imperial Army soldiers, under the towering walls of the royal palace, no one would be able to break through the obstruction of so many people, kill their way into the royal palace, and point their sword at the emperor. Unless there really was a god in this world. Thus, the Imperial Army thought this strange blind man was perhaps a madman with extremely bad luck. In such a tense situation, to suddenly charge into the forbidden area in front of the royal palace, what awaited him could only be death. Wu Zhu continued to walk, as if he did not see the row of Imperial Army soldiers blocking him in front of him. At this time, the wind and rain that filled the sky were still wreaking havoc. The endless rain was like a huge wave on the East Sea, about to swallow up his lonely figure. In the end, it was unable to swallow him because he walked out of the rain. Kill. An Imperial Army officer narrowed his eyes slightly. He felt a bone-piercing chill coming from the body of the blind man not far away. The blind man had already walked into the forbidden area. Furthermore, a sense of danger made the officer give the order without any hesitation. With a swoosh, the Imperial Army soldiers blocking in front of Wu Zhu drew their swords in unison. In an instant, the light of the swords lit up the rainy sky in front of the royal palace. There was no loud swishing of swords. Wu Zhu only steadily pulled out the metal drill at his waist and then stabbed out. His speed did not appear fast in the ruthless wind and rain. Furthermore, the way he stabbed out with the drill was not particularly exquisite. However, each time the metal drill was thrust out, the tip of the drill would accurately pierce the throat of an Imperial Army soldier. Accurate, clean, and stable. This was the feeling Wu Zhu felt when he attacked. It was very simple, but when it reached the extreme, it became a certain realm. From the time the officer said the word kill, to when Wu Zhu killed all the Imperial Army soldiers in front of him, only a few breaths had passed. In the sky full of rain, the ground behind Wu Zhu was littered with bodies. Fresh blood had just surged out from the throats of the bodies when it was washed away by the rain. In the process of killing, Wu Zhu's speed did not change at all. His 2 feet advancing in the rain remained steady, as if he had not encountered any hindrance. He moved through the rain and killed as he went. This was not the ease of a peerless ace. It did not give the Imperial Army soldiers around the royal palace the feeling of a powerful warrior taking a leisurely stroll. They only felt cold, very cold. The blind man's attacks were steady, steady to the point of incomparable coldness. The Imperial soldiers didn't even know how their colleagues had died to that metal drill. This was because the blind man in the bamboo hat didn't exude an aura that could pierce through the heavens and earth, and his attacks weren't particularly crafty or vicious. However, the metal drill seemed to be covered in a layer of heavenly coldness. In the rain, it easily calculated all the angles and possibilities. Then, it chose the most reasonable crack in space and passed it out. It seemed to be simple, yet it was actually capable of shaking the heavens and the earth, and it was sufficient to cause everyone who witnessed this scene to completely lose all confidence in going against him. The officer watched helplessly as his subordinates died at the hands of the blind man wearing the straw hat without even making a sound. He felt a chill throughout his body, colder than the autumn rain that fell incessantly around him. Wu Zhu walked in front of him. The officer suddenly felt that the other party's clothes, which had been soaked by the rain and had turned dark, were not ordinary clothes. The metal drill in the other party's hand was also not an ordinary weapon. The other party was not a person, but a monster that condensed all the mysteries between heaven and earth and breathed in all the coldness between heaven and earth. The officer's entire body trembled. He bravely pulled out his knife. Then, he saw the metal drill pierce into his chin. It was then pulled back like a flash of lightning. Too fast. Why did it seem so slow earlier? Why couldn't he dodge it no matter what? The officer fell heavily into the rain with these questions in his mind. His eyes, filled with fear, were gradually drowned by the water. Then, he saw a pair of soaked cloth shoes walk past his head. At this moment, the feet wearing the cloth shoes were still as steady as ever. The rain continued to fall, and the Imperial soldiers continued to die. The fear of the unknown brought about by the god of killing in the bamboo hat made the Imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace extremely angry and courageous. Wave after wave, they charged forward to kill. However, these Imperial army soldiers were unable to stop Wu Zhu's steady footsteps in the slightest. Wu Zhu lowered his head, turned around, and bent his knees. With a calmness and calculation that completely exceeded the imagination of mortals, he calmly moved aside all the weapons that could harm his body. Then, he thrust out the metal drill and tore apart the curtain of autumn rain in front of him. He tore apart the layers of encirclement in front of him. He only wanted to enter the royal palace to take a look. Because of this, people continuously fell by his side. Blood continuously dyed the curtain of rain red. People continuously died and fell into the rain. There were incessant cries of alarm, miserable screams, and muffled grunts. He was like an emissary of heaven who had fallen into the dust for some unknown reason. Using the calmest and most terrifying method, he was harvesting the guards by the emperor's side and harvesting the lives of the common and lowly. The people in front of Wu Zhu grew fewer and fewer, but the corpses on the ground grew more and more. Suddenly, Wu Zhu stopped in the middle of the square in front of the royal palace. There was no longer a single person standing by his side. Around him, hundreds of Imperial army soldiers lay in pools of blood. No matter how violent the autumn rain was, it could not wash away the blood in an instant. He slowly raised his head and looked above the royal palace. The Imperial army on the palace walls had long drawn their bows and nocked their arrows. The densely packed arrows were already aimed at Wu Zhu in front of the palace gates. At any moment, tens of thousands of arrows could be fired. Wu Zhu stood in the blood and raised his head. Separated by the black cloth, he looked at the familiar yet strange royal palace and the terrifying arrows. His face that was exposed outside the cloth was still calm. There was no fear at all. He only slowly raised his right arm and extended the metal drill in his hand into the torrential rain, allowing the rain to wash away the bloodstains on it. The rain struck the metal drill with a pitter-patter. The Imperial army, who had been struck out of their wits by the metal drill, had been ordered back into the palace gates. At this moment, the vermilion palace gates were tightly shut. Other than the bloody corpses lying on the ground, there was only the stormy sea of wind and rain and the blind man wearing the straw hat standing alone. Countless people on the royal palace saw this scene and felt a chill from the depths of their hearts. Who exactly was this unimaginably powerful blind man? The pale-faced commander of the Imperial army, Gong Dian, stood on the palace walls and watched the blind man standing alone in the rain. His body trembled slightly. He thought of the woman and her young servant many years ago. An unprecedented fear welled up in the depths of his heart. He knew who the other party was. At the first moment, he had already notified the emperor in the palace. However, he had no idea whether or not his tens of thousands of Imperial army soldiers could stop the other party. Wu Zhu had come. Wu Zhu had finally come. He had come to avenge the mistress. These words that made his heart tremble echoed endlessly in Gong Dian's heart. Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the wind and rain and used a metal drill to challenge the entire powerful Qin court, did not have these thoughts. He only suddenly said to himself, "The one living inside seems to be Xiao Lizi." The wind and rain filled the sky, and this person stood alone. Although there were millions of people, he would go forward. It's the last few days. My feelings are very complicated. Brothers and sisters, please give more recommendation votes and flower votes. Everyone, together, let's make the ending of the story of Qin Yu a little more beautiful, a little more beautiful. Chapter 766. There should be 3 more chapters. There are 3 more chapters. Then, there is a final chapter and a postscript. Anger, resentment, sorrow. Let's all vote for the recommendation. Only yesterday did I discover that flower tickets also cost money. Yes, let's work hard together and make a pretty cattail. Fire the arrows. The pale-faced commander of the Imperial Army gave the order in a trembling voice as rainwater dripped from Gong Dian's messy beard. Countless arrows left the taut bowstrings. Abruptly, their speed rose to a peak. They tore through the rain in the air and shot toward Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the middle of the square. The densely packed arrows seemed like they were going to cover the sky and the sun. However, the torrential rain had stolen this effect first. Thus, it was as if the countless arrows that flew out were dissatisfied. They tore apart all of the raindrops in the air between heaven and earth, making the sky above the square become a large curtain of water like a divine realm. Contrasted with this terrifying power were the sinister whistling of the arrows as they pierced through the air. These sounds represented the Qin kingdom's powerful military power and an irresistible killing intent. No one could survive such a dense arrow attack, not even Fan Xian. Even Yi Lu Yun on Dong Mountain had only faced a few hundred arrows. Furthermore, in that kind of terrain, a great grandmaster's swift movements had always been their greatest protection. How to kill a great grandmaster? Fan Xian had once thought deeply about this problem. It had to be done on the plains. Tens of thousands of arrows fired in unison, and then heavily armored riders charged in succession. Only then could they not give a great grandmaster a chance to escape. Standing alone in the rain, Wu Zhu was very powerful. At least, those who knew his name never thought he was weaker than a great grandmaster. It was clear that the Imperial Army's retreat and release of arrows matched Fan Xian's plan back then. The square was wide. Although it was raining, there was nothing that could block one's line of sight. How could Wu Zhu dodge? There were people who could fight 1 against 10,000. However, when the arrows were fired in unison, it was like the power of 10,000 people coming together. How could they be blocked? Faced with arrows that were even denser than the torrential rain, could Wu Zhu still stand in the center of the plaza with incomparable strength? Wu Zhu's movements were not as fast as Yi Liyun's. Wu Zhu's attacks were not as wild and ruthless as Sigujian's. Wu Zhu was unable to use the power of the rain to escape like Ku He. He only raised his head coldly. Separated by the layer of wet black cloth, he looked at the black rain of arrows coming at him. The strong wind pressed against his face and enveloped an area of dozens of feet around him. The tip of the arrow pierced through the raindrops and arrived in front of him. In the present world, the person with the best qinggong should be Fan Xian. With the help of the magic book Ku he had left behind, he could leap over 30 meters on the snowy ground. However, even he, faced with this sky full of arrows, had no way to suddenly move like lightning and leap out of the range of the rain of arrows. Thus, Wu Zhu's body did not move. He did not try to avoid this rain of arrows, which had clearly been accumulating power for a long time, because no one could avoid it. He only pulled back the metal rod in the rain and held it horizontally in front of his chest. Like a door, it suddenly closed, locking his figure behind the rain and fog. Thud, thud, thud! The terrifying sound of countless arrows piercing their targets seemed to ring out at the same time. Some of the powerful arrows pierced into the stone tiles under Wu Zhu's feet and bounced up violently. In the air, they could not withstand the great force of the arrows and snapped with a crisp crack. Some of the arrows shot directly into the narrow gaps between the stone tiles. The feathers of the arrows buzzed. In an instant, countless arrows enveloped Wu Zhu's slightly thin body. After countless heart-palpitating sounds, the entire royal palace was silent. Everyone's pupils gradually constricted in fear as they looked at the scene in front of them in disbelief. The arrows were like weeds that had been brushed aside by the spring rain. They were densely inserted into the ground and splashed into the air in the center of the square in front of the royal palace. In the center of the densest rain of arrows, Wu Zhu continued to stand silently. At some point, the bamboo hat that he had always worn was now in his hand. Countless arrows pierced through it. It looked like a black ball of fur, exuding a cold light. His right hand still held the metal drill steadily. Below his right hand were countless arrows that had been broken by him. The rain-soaked square was filled with arrows. Wu Zhu stood among the broken arrows. Other than where his feet were standing, there was a ground full of broken killing intent. It was as if he was the only person left standing on the clean ground in the world. The rain suddenly lessened. It was as if the heavens were beginning to faintly fear this blind man who still stood stubbornly under the tens of thousands of arrows and wanted to see this scene more clearly. Thus, a crack suddenly appeared in the thick rain clouds above the royal palace. The sunlight shone down through the crack and shone on Wu Zhu's body, faintly illuminating this blind man in plain clothes with a clear light. In the light rain, the autumn wind brushed past. Wu Zhu's soaked clothes gently fluttered. With a rustling sound, the bamboo hat in his left hand, which had withstood countless arrows, finally died of old age. In his hand it scattered in all directions, like a fragile lantern. No one knew what had happened. The imperial army had no idea how such a miraculous scene had appeared in the world. The moment the tens of thousands of arrows neared his body, Wu Zhu had actually moved. However, he had moved too quickly. The metal drill in his hand and the straw hat, which was spinning at high speed, all became afterimages in the rain. No one could see them at all. Wu Zhu's feet were like two stakes, standing deep in the ground. The metal drill in his right hand seemed to have a life of its own. It completely calculated the trajectory of each arrow. Furthermore, with the powerful execution ability of Wu Zhu's limbs, he inconceivably cut down each arrow that truly pierced toward his body. Earlier, each time the metal drill slashed horizontally, it was forcefully limited by Wu Zhu to within the range of his body. It did not exceed an inch. He allowed the whistling arrows to brush past his clothes, his earlobes, and his thighs. He did not even glance at these arrows. The front of his soaked cloth shoes was full of arrows. Wu Zhu did not block them even once. This kind of absolute calculation ability and the confidence that came with it, as well as the valiant will it demonstrated, was not something that could be found in the mortal world. If it was any other great grandmaster, it would probably be impossible for them to be as calm as Wu Zhu earlier. In this world, other than Wu Zhu, no one could calculate so many things in such a short amount of time and, in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, be able to make the most appropriate response. The tens of thousands of arrows were fired at once. They had to cover all of the areas where Wu Zhu could possibly dodge. Thus, the arrows that actually shot toward Wu Zhu's body were not that many. However, in this world, other than Wu Zhu, who could still make such a calm judgment in such a dangerous moment, not many was only for Wu Zhu. Even so, the metal drill in his hand could not instantly cut down all of the concentrated arrows flying toward him. Thus, his left hand also moved. He directly took off the straw hat he wore on his head and began to spin it quickly in the rain. It swirled up countless arcs of rain and shook away countless arrows. The straw hat shattered like a lantern. With a crash, it fell to the wet ground and sent up countless broken arrows. With some difficulty, Wu Zhu straightened the 5 fingers on his left hand and looked at the arrows that had pierced through his arm. A very real emotion suddenly appeared on his originally expressionless face. It hurts a bit, Wu Zhu thought to himself. He then pulled out the arrows that had pierced deep into his bone and even out of his left forearm. The sound of the arrows rubbing against the flesh of his forearm seemed to cover up the gradually fading sound of the rain. The top and bottom of the royal palace was silent. Clear light shone down through the crack in the sky above Jingdo, and shone on Wu Zhu's thin body. Slowly, and as if he didn't feel anything, he pulled the arrow out of his body. He then wiped away the liquid flowing from his wound and raised his foot again. When this step landed, the sound of arrows shattering filled the air. Wu Zhu was stepping on the pile of arrows in front of him as he walked toward the royal palace. The morale of the imperial army dropped to its lowest point, even lower than it had been a year ago when that startling sound had been heard. Although the fear of the unknown was terrifying, it was not as terrifying as seeing a monster with their own eyes. They didn't know who the warrior standing tall in the rain of arrows below the royal palace was. Unconsciously, they thought that the other party was not human. He was probably some kind of monster. Or an immortal? Given the strict discipline of the Qing army, even if they were faced with a great grandmaster who was praised by tens of thousands of people, perhaps they would not pause at all. Instead, they would use a torrential rain of arrows to kill the enemies of the Qing kingdom. However, today they truly felt fear. That was because that expert had not only displayed his unparalleled power, but more importantly, they were shocked by the indifference displayed by that expert. When Wu Zhu stepped on the densely packed pile of arrows that were like long grass in spring and was about to reach the palace gates, the second wave of arrows still did not fall. The pale-faced Gong Dian watched in a daze as the blind man came closer and closer. He suddenly felt a bitterness in his mouth. Sir Wu was already too close to the royal palace. Even if he attacked with arrows again, the effect would probably not be as good as before. Was the mission the emperor had given him truly impossible to complete? In this life, the Qing emperor only feared two things. One was the black chest, and the other was Lao Wu, who was walking steadily toward him. In the 20 years after the Taiping courtyard murder case, the emperor had wanted to eliminate Wu Zhu from this world more than once. However, in the end, he had still failed. In order to deal with Wu Zhu's revenge, the emperor had his own plans. Fan Xian had returned from the temple, so Wu Zhu had followed him back. The Qing emperor had never hoped for heaven to give him a pleasant surprise. He had actually not prepared much for Wu Zhu because there were not many ways in the world that could keep Wu Zhu in check. Furthermore, the Qing kingdom only had a gradually aging, tired, and injured emperor. Great Master Yi Luyun had long floated far away. In the Qing emperor's view, the only way to eliminate Wu Zhu was this wall of the royal palace, the obstruction of countless imperial soldiers, and the fire that filled the sky. A few years ago, in the wasteland behind the Qing temple, the Qing emperor had personally seen the emissary of the temple gradually melt into a strange object in the fire. He had also heard the crackling sounds with his own ears. Gong Dian was the person specifically carrying out the Qing emperor's plan to eliminate Wu Zhu. For this, the imperial army had prepared fire arrows and corresponding facilities. However, heaven seemed to have truly abandoned the man it had chosen in the world in the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar. When Wu Zhu arrived outside the royal palace with a strange and heavy mood, a storm that was rarely seen in a century in Jingdo suddenly fell from the sky. The pouring rain dealt a heavy blow to Gong Dian's preparations. It was as if he wanted to use this to wash away the past of the Qing court and send off a powerful ruler. Gong Dian took a deep breath and looked at Wu Zhu, who was coming closer and closer. He stopped releasing arrows and ordered in a raspy voice, "Prepare the oil." If he wanted to envelop Wu Zhu below the palace walls in a sea of fire, the explosive poison plan he had set up through the Overwatch Council during the Jingdo Rebellion 4 years ago was, without question, the most powerful. 4 years ago, Fan Xian had already hidden a large amount of gunpowder in the Overwatch Council's stockpile under the little building. Most importantly, this rain that filled the sky, this damned rain. Thus, Gong Dian could only hope that the oil would be able to kill Sir Wu below the palace walls. The oil splashed down, but it could not splash onto Wu Zhu's body. Wu Zhu walked slowly and steadily, but he was like an antelope flying on a precipice as he arrived in front of the palace doors. The rain gradually lessened. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls finally lit a dozen fire arrows and shot them all down. The moment the flames touched the oil mixed with the water below the palace walls, they immediately began to burn fiercely. The flames were like a torrential rain rising from the ground, a rain of fire. Abruptly, a giant tongue of flame shot out, wanting to swallow Wu Zhu's lonely figure. Wu Zhu flew up. More accurately, he walked. It completely exceeded all human imaginations. The metal drill in his hand pierced into a crack about 6 feet above the royal palace. His body was like an arrow shot from a bowstring. It sped up rapidly and turned into a cold shadow. On the smooth and straight palace walls, his feet crossed endlessly as he ran toward the palace walls. No one could describe this scene. Wu Zhu was on the road, on the palace walls, running toward the rainy sky. When Wu Zhu's feet, wearing cloth shoes, landed firmly on the palace walls, Gong Dian knew that the situation was lost. In this world, other than the emperor, there was no one else who could stop Wu Zhu from entering the palace. Under the autumn rain, a thunderous sound of horse hooves suddenly came from a corner of the square. There were not many riders, but they were particularly stern. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, currently the foremost person in the Qing military, Commander Yizhong, had finally rushed over from the Bureau of Military Affairs. Yizhong's expression was shocked and ashen. The rain made his grizzled hair stick to his slightly black face. He looked unusually wretched. He looked at the lonely, blind figure on the palace walls from a distance. He jumped off his horse and sprinted wildly toward the palace walls in the rain. He almost tripped and fell. In a stern voice he yelled, "Sir Wu, don't be rash. I know the temple has been abandoned, but I thought that since Lao Wu is a person of the temple would have a way to keep him there. Who knew that he would actually be able to return to the world? Why did the wicked heavens have to rain so heavily today? Why is this so? I have the world in my heart and control tens of thousands of li of rivers and mountains in my hand. Unexpectedly, I have been forced in front of me by a man. Who can tell me why? How unfair the heavens are! If I was given a few more days, no, if I had not been injured by that chest that day, why would I fear Lao Wu coming? But, even if Lao Wu came? So what? The emperor, who occasionally heard urgent reports from outside the palace but still maintained a calm expression, suddenly had a cold smile rise to the corners of his lips. Slowly rising from the throne, he steadily raised his hands and had eunuch Yao at his side carefully check for wrinkles on his dragon robe. There were many kinds of dragon robes. The one the Qing emperor was wearing was very close to his body. Presumably, it would not affect his attack later. However, why did the wrinkles at the corners of the emperor's eyes appear so tired? So faint and sorrowful? Standing in the quiet and empty Taiji palace, the Qing emperor put his hands behind his back and was silent for a long time. His hair had been neatly combed and carelessly tied with a light yellow ribbon at the back of his head. He appeared particularly elegant. After a long time, he slowly opened his eyes. There was no longer the faint self-mockery in them when he questioned himself earlier. There was only calmness and powerful confidence. The emperor's calm and cold gaze followed the open doors of Taiji Palace, passed through the square in front of the palace, and continued toward the main gates of the royal palace, where the sounds of killing were gradually rising. He knew that Lao Wu would come from there in a moment. He knew Lao Wu's personality. In his life, he would only take the most direct path. "Have you found Fan Xian?" His eyelids were slightly lowered as he gently turned a jade ring between his fingers. He asked casually. "Not yet," eunuch Yao reported respectfully to the side. "The young lady of the Fan family disappeared last night." The emperor closed his eyes and thought deeply for a moment. He then said, "It looks like I have still underestimated many people, such as Ruoro." Eunuch Yao didn't dare to continue. He only felt that it was unusually strange. After the palace learned of the accurate news that Fan Xian had entered the capital, the emperor had invited the young lady of the Fan family into the palace at the first opportunity. It was clear that the emperor had his hands on Fan Xian's lifeline. However, the young lady of the Fan family had suddenly disappeared from the palace. If the young lady of the Fan family was a hidden ace, why had she been invited into the palace by the internal court and not escaped outside the palace? The tens of thousands of imperial soldiers outside the royal palace were still using their flesh and blood to stubbornly stop Wu Zhu from entering. The path was covered in blood, but not a single imperial soldier took a step back. Even when Sigujian used a wooden stick to kill ants under the tree, he still needed time. Furthermore, he was killing people now. Wu Zhu continued to kill calmly. However, the people in front of him never decreased. No one knew how much longer he would have to kill. There's still an hour left. The emperor always seemed to be able to accurately grasp the development of everything in the world. He slowly walked out of Taiji Palace and stood in the long corridor. Looking at the increasingly sparse rain outside, he seemed to be deep in thought. The eunuchs and serving girls in the royal palace retreated far away with nervous expressions. There was only Eunuch Yao by the emperor's side. He appeared very lonely. The emperor's brows suddenly furrowed and he gently coughed a few times. He accepted a pure white silk handkerchief from Eunuch Yao's hand and wiped the corner of his mouth. Coldly, he said, "If Nji still doesn't act, this matter will be interesting." The atmosphere in the royal palace was unusually tense and serious. There was not a trace of liveliness. It was rather boring. Fan Xian was among the eunuchs at the end of Taiji Palace's long corridor. He watched the middle-aged man in the distance, or perhaps it should be said old man, with unusually heavy and complicated emotions. Just after midnight, Fan Xian had come alone to the royal palace under the cover of the pitch-black night. This time, he did not try to do what he had done that year after the poetry conference in front of the palace and climb into the palace like a gecko. In Jingdo, because of the raging war in the north, and more so because of his return, the defenses had been raised to a terrifying level. It was already an impossible task to climb over the wall and enter. Thus, Fan Xian used the chess piece he had buried the deepest in this world. Other than him, only Wang Qinian knew about this chess piece. Deng Ziyu only had a faint understanding of it. It was Hong Zhu. Presently, Hong Zhu had returned to the royal study and was once again favored. With the secret guidance and help of this popular figure in the palace, Fan Xian appeared relaxed, but in reality, it was extremely dangerous to sneak into the royal palace through the direction of the laundry workshop. Fan Xian had not thought about what the consequences would be if Hong Zhu sold him out. He had already come this far in his second life. What else did he not dare to lose? After sneaking into the royal palace, Fan Xian learned of the news that his sister had once again been received into the royal palace. He immediately understood the emperor's thoughts. It looked like at this moment of life and death, the man sitting on the throne had finally torn off all pretense and was prepared to directly use Ruoro's life to threaten him. This was different from when Ruoro had been a hostage. At that time, the emperor had enough confidence in him, so he could still maintain his face as a saint. Fan Xian was also not worried that he would actually use his sister's life to threaten him. Now the emperor was already old. His lingering injuries had not healed at all. He probably also smelled a glimmer of death. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and carefully lowered his head. Behind the serving girls, he gazed at the emperor in front of Taiji Palace through the gaps in their clothes. For a moment, his emotions were complicated. He also knew of the strange movements in the royal palace and guessed Uncle Wu Zhu's arrival. However, he could not understand. Had Uncle Wu Zhu truly woken up? No matter what, Fan Xian knew the strength of these powerful warriors and the powerful battle power of the Qing army. Even if Wu Zhu valiantly broke through the imperial army's defenses, he would still be injured when he came to Taiji Palace. Faced with the calm and unruffled Emperor, what were Uncle Wu Zhu's chances of victory? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.